Welcome back to Park Ranger Files. Tonight's accounts all came from the roads submitted by people who drove California's highways, backroads, and mountain passes and encountered something they couldn't file away. Read straight, nothing added. Nothing. Story 1. I've driven Highway 395 more times than I can count, running the eastern side of the Sierra between LA and Reno for work. And I know that road the way freight drivers know their routes, every rest stop, every grade, every stretch where the cell signal dies. It's one of the loneliest highways in the state once you get above Mojave. And I mean that as a compliment most of the time. Long straight runs through high desert scrub, the mountains on your left going from brown to white depending on the season, and at night almost no traffic and no ambient light, and a sky that does things you forget skies can do if you spend most of your time in cities. I want to tell you what 395 feels like at midnight in November, because it matters to the account. The high desert above Mojave goes flat and enormous, and the road is the only thing in it that belongs to this century. You get a sense, driving it at night, of the depth of time in the land on either side of you, the volcanic fields you pass through south of Bishop, black and lumped and recent in geological terms, but ancient and human ones. The dry lake beds that were full of water in eras before memory. The fault lines that run parallel to the road and are responsible for both the Sierra on your left and the White Mountains on your right. It's a road that passes through country that was doing significant things long before it became a route. And at night when there's no other traffic and the darkness goes forever in every direction, you can feel that. I always felt it, and I always found it clarifying rather than unsettling. Right up until November that year, running the eastern side of the Sierra between LA and Reno for work. And I know that road the way freight drivers know their routes, every rest stop, every grade, every stretch where the cell signal dies. It's one of the loneliest highways in the state once you get above Mojave, and I mean that as a compliment most of the time. Long straight runs through high desert scrub, the mountains on your left going from brown to white depending on the season, and at night almost no traffic and no ambient light, and a sky that does things you forget skies can do if you spend most of your time in cities. The trip I want to tell you about was a November run, northbound, and I was making good time. Left Lancaster at 9, through Mojave by 10, and by midnight I was somewhere in the long empty stretch north of Lone Pine, where the road runs through the high desert flats between the Sierra Crest and the White Mountains. And there's genuinely nothing out there. No towns, no side roads worth mentioning, just the dark and the road and the occasional jackrabbit in the headlights. I'd done this stretch 100 times and I knew every mile of it. I had my coffee and my audiobook and I was fine. About 15 miles north of Independence, I picked up a hitchhiker. I need to explain that before you get the wrong idea, because I don't pick up hitchhikers, I never have. Not in 20 years of driving this road. But this wasn't someone with a thumb out. A woman was standing on the shoulder, not hitchhiking, just standing there. And she was lit by my headlights from about half a mile out. And the longer I had her in my lights, the more wrong the situation looked. She wasn't wearing reflective gear. She had no pack. It was 32 degrees that night, and I had the heater on, and she was standing on the shoulder of a desert highway in the dark at midnight, with no apparent reason for being there. I slowed down. I pulled over about 30 yards past her. In the mirror, I watched her walk up to the passenger side, and I unlocked the door and she got in. She was maybe 60, dressed like she'd been at a dinner party. Dark slacks, a nice blouse, shoes that had no business being on a desert roadside. No coat, not shaking, which was what I noticed first, because at 32 degrees, standing on the shoulder for any length of time without a coat, you shake. She wasn't. She looked at me with complete composure and said thank you, and I asked her if she was all right. And she said she was fine, and that she needed to get to Bishop, which was 40 miles north, the next real town. I drove. I asked what had happened, car trouble. She'd been with someone, what, and she said she'd been out walking and lost track of time. I've since thought hard about that answer, and it still doesn't hold together. Because what person goes out for a walk in evening clothes from a location that has nothing within 15 miles in any direction? But at the time, I was focused on getting her warm, and I turned the heat up, and I asked if she wanted water or food, and she said no, she was fine. She just needed to get to Bishop. She talked. That was the strange thing. The thing I held on to later, she wasn't silent or distressed or odd in her manner. She was easy conversation. She told me about Bishop, the town where she'd lived and where she liked to eat, and a restaurant that had changed ownership 3 times since she was young. She talked about the road, 395, and she knew it well. She talked about landmarks and history with a familiarity that came from a long time in that country. She was, if I'm honest, the best company I'd had on that drive in years, warm and specific and funny in a quiet way. I want to describe one specific part of the conversation more, because it's the part that stayed with me longest. At some point in the hour, between Independence and Bishop, we got onto the subject of the White Mountains, the range on the east side of the highway. She said she'd spent time in the Whites, which are less visited than the Sierra, but have their own extraordinary qualities. The ancient bristlecone pines up near the summit plateau, some of the oldest living things on Earth, trees that were old when the Romans were building their empire. She said she liked the Whites because they were honest about age in a way that most places weren't, that they didn't pretend to be current. She said the bristlecones were remarkable specifically because they didn't die clean, they died gradually, section by section, part of the tree still living while other parts were centuries dead, and that you could have a tree that was simultaneously alive and dead in its different parts, and that this was how she thought about the country out here generally. That the past and the present existed in the same physical space simultaneously, rather than one replacing the other. I said something like that was a poetic way to think about it, and she said, no, she thought it was just accurate, that the desert didn't clear itself of what had been there before, it just added to it, and the old things were still there if you knew how to look. I thought she was talking about geology, about the visible strata and the canyon walls, that kind of thing. I've thought since that she might have been telling me something more personal. We got to Bishop. She directed me off the highway into a residential neighborhood on the north side of town, a street of old small houses under big trees, and she said here, and I pulled over in front of a house with a porch light on. She thanked me, opened the door, and walked up the path to the front door. I watched her go up the steps. I watched her reach the door. And then I was watching an empty porch with a light on and a closed front door, and no person anywhere, on the path or the steps or anywhere in my headlights. And the front door had not opened. I sat there for what was probably 2 minutes. I got out of the car, which I can't fully explain, and walked up to the porch. The door was locked. I knocked. Nobody answered. I stepped back and looked at the house. All the windows dark except the porch light. And I had the particular skin-crawling calmness that comes when something has happened that your mind hasn't caught up to yet. I knocked one more time, harder, and stood on the porch long enough to look at the house in detail. The porch had a quality of long use, the boards worn in the path from the step to the door. A chair that had been there for years, the paint on the railing faded in the pattern of hands that had rested on it. The porch light had one of those yellow bulbs that older houses use, the kind that were supposed to keep the moths away, and it cast everything in an amber that made the house look like a photograph. On the door frame, just visible in the light, there was a weather-stripping seal that had partially come away and been pushed back, the kind of small repair that happens over years of use, that you only make to a door you use every day. Someone had lived there a long time and used that door every day. I went back to my car and I drove to Bishop's only late-night diner, and I sat and drank coffee for an hour before I got back on the road. In the morning, I looked up the address online, and the house came up in county property records as belonging to an estate. Owner deceased, currently in probate. The deceased had been a woman. The name in the records matched nothing I could search to a photograph, and I didn't push it further because I wasn't sure what I was looking for. What I've sat with since is the conversation, the detail of it. She knew Bishop the way someone who'd spent a lifetime there would know it. The restaurants and the roads, and the way things had changed over the years. She talked about the country around 395 with a love and a specificity that felt earned over decades. And I've thought about the fact that she wasn't cold, standing on the shoulder at 32 degrees, and that she wasn't shaking, and that she walked up the path to her front door and stopped being there. I think she needed to get home. I think she'd been trying to get home for a while. I think about the porch light that was on in an empty house, and I choose to believe she made it, in whatever way that means. Before I tell you about going back in the daylight, I want to tell you about a conversation I had at a truck stop in Lone Pine a few months after the trip. Because it changed how I thought about 395 and about what I'd experienced. I was fueling up at a stop I used regularly, and there was another long-haul driver I'd seen there before, a woman who ran the 395 corridor for a produce company. And we got to talking the way road people do when they're fueling up at the same time. I mentioned the experience, not in full detail, just that I'd picked up a passenger north of Independence who'd asked to go to Bishop and had seemed unusual, and I described her lightly older evening clothes, no coat in 32-degree weather, knew the country well. And the woman looked at me and said, "What color was the blouse?" I said I didn't remember, dark, maybe navy. She said she'd picked up a woman matching that description twice on 395. About 2 years apart, both times north of Independence. Both times asking to go to Bishop. She said the first time she delivered her to a neighborhood on the north side of Bishop, same situation as me, walked up a path, wasn't there? When she looked up, and the second time she'd recognized the woman, as soon as she got in the car, and had said, "I've driven you before." And the woman had said yes, and thank you for stopping, and had ridden to Bishop and walked up the same path and not been there when the driver looked up. The driver said she'd been shaken the second time in a way the first time hadn't fully gotten to her, because the second time established a pattern, and patterns are real in a way that single incidents can be rationalized away. I asked her if she'd ever gone back to the house. She said yes, she'd looked it up and found the same thing I found, an estate and probate deceased owner. She said she'd gone back once in daylight and sat outside for a while, the same impulse I'd have a year later, and she'd had the sense sitting there that she'd done the right thing both times by stopping, and that whatever was happening on that road and in that house, the right response was to drive the woman home when she needed driving, because that was a thing that could be done, and she did it. I did one more thing about a year after the trip that I haven't told anyone. I drove back up to Bishop on a Saturday in the fall, in the daylight, and I found the street and the house. It was still in the same state it had been that night, porch light on. Windows dark. The estate notice visible in the county records when I checked my phone sitting in front of it. An older woman had lived there most of her adult life, the records showed, and had died without immediate heirs, and the estate was slowly working through probate. The house itself appeared maintained, the way old houses sometimes are when estates are being properly managed, but no one was living in it. I sat in front of it for a while. The street was quiet, residential old Bishop neighborhood, with big cottonwoods dropping their leaves in the fall light. I thought about a woman who had loved that country, the road and the mountains and the whites, who had talked about the bristlecones and the way the desert held its past without clearing it away. I thought about what it would mean to her to still be on that road in November, trying to get home. I want to say something about the porch light, because it's the detail I think about most, and I've never given it the attention it deserves. A porch light on in an empty house that's been in probate for what must have been some time. Waiting to be settled and transferred with no timer and no one living there to turn it on. I've gone back and forth on whether that was something I should have investigated more thoroughly when I was standing on the porch. And I've decided the answer is no, because I'm not an investigator. And what I was dealing with wasn't an investigation. It was a person getting home. My job was what the other driver's job was: to stop, to provide the ride, to drive the woman home. I did that. Whether the mechanics of how she got from the car to the door involved something I can't explain doesn't change the service rendered. But the light. Someone was keeping a light on. For a house in probate with the owner deceased on a residential street in Bishop, a porch light was on in the 9 o'clock hour. The same hour Harold leaves his light on in that other account. The hour a person would come home in the evening. I've thought about what keeps a light on in a house when nobody's there to turn it on. And I've thought about the bristle cones she described. The trees that are simultaneously alive and dead. The parts that persist after other parts have ceased. I think some presences keep a light on the way a habit keeps going after the person who formed it is gone. Not intentionally, not with effort. Just the momentum of a lifetime of coming home to a porch light. The way the door in that house had the specific wear of someone who'd used it every day for years. The wear outlasts the user. The habit outlasts the person. I still drive 395. I still do the midnight runs. I've never picked up another hitchhiker. But I want to say one last thing about what the 395 gives you at midnight in November, because I described it earlier in terms of what it costs, and I want to balance that with what it gives. Because the woman knew the road and loved it, and that matters. The high desert above 10,000 feet in November at midnight. No other traffic. The mountains on both sides. The sky doing its thing. It is one of the most extraordinary driving environments in the state. And I've driven it enough that it's become ordinary to me. But the woman reminded me on that drive that ordinary and extraordinary aren't opposites. That you can know a thing for years, and it can still be doing what it was doing when it first got your attention. She talked about the country the way people talk about something they've loved for a long time, with the specificity that comes from years of attention, and the lightness that comes from knowing the attention is permanent. You're not going to stop. She talked about the winter stars from the desert floor, the Milky Way visible as a solid structure on a clear night, the planets tracking across the sky you can watch from a pullout. She talked about the morning light on the White Mountains before the Sierra puts them in shadow, the specific color of the light on that eastern range at dawn. She'd given that country 30 years of attention, and she was giving it to me compressed into an hour's drive. And I received it. And I've thought about the country differently since, and the way you think differently about a place when you've heard someone who loved it tell you why. I find myself, every time I pass that stretch north of Independence, slowing down a little and looking at the shoulder. And I don't know if I'm hoping to see her again or hoping not to. And I've decided that living in that honest uncertainty is better than resolving it in either direction. The 395 at midnight in November is mine. Still, after all of it, the road gave me something, and I gave the road something back, which is the attention I now pay to the shoulder north of Independence every time I pass it. And maybe that's the whole exchange. Maybe that's all it ever needed. I drive it still. I always will. I've thought about that uncertainty for a long time, and I've decided it's honest rather than evasive. Both things are true simultaneously. I would like to see her again, because if I see her again, it means she's still out there, still on the road, still trying to get home. And that means I can stop again. I can drive her to Bishop again. I can do what I was useful for that night. And I don't want to see her again, because if I see her again, it means she's still on the shoulder at 32 degrees in evening clothes with no coat, still needing a ride, still not quite home. And that second meaning is a sadder one. The other driver, the woman from the produce company who'd picked her up twice, had the better framework. She stopped because a person needed a ride. She provided the ride. She'd do it again. No ambivalence. Just the useful thing, done without drama and without requirement of resolution. I aspire to that. I have the useful thing available to me, a truck, a route. The 395 at midnight in November. And if she's on the shoulder again, I'll stop. I'll turn the heat up. I'll listen to everything she wants to say about the country and the bristlecones and the way the desert holds its past. And I'll drive her to that street in Bishop and I'll watch her walk up the path. And this time I'll say goodnight before she disappears. Because the other driver was right. Some things don't require explanation or resolution. They only require the courtesy of being done. You stop. You see the person. You drive them home. The porch light is on. She'd kept it on all those years, the way the habit outlasts the person who formed it. And the house is hers. And she made it, and that's enough. And I don't know if I'm hoping to see her again or hoping not to. Story 2. This is going to sound like a lot of things that have explanations. And I want to say up front that I've tried every explanation over the 4 years since this happened, and none of them account for all of it at once. Some of it, sure. All of it together, no. This account is going to have a dry, factual quality to it, because that's how my brain works. And because the dry, factual quality is, I've decided, actually the best way to present it. My training is in electrical engineering, and I process experiences as data sets, which is both useful and occasionally inadequate. This is an occasion where it was inadequate. My wife and I were driving PCH from San Francisco down to her parents in San Diego. 2 days, slow drive, the whole coastal experience. It was late May and the road was doing everything PCH is supposed to do. The cliffs and the fog lifting off the ocean by mid-morning and the light on the water in the afternoon. We'd stopped in Cambria for lunch and we were heading south through the stretch that gets remote below San Simeon, the long stretch where the hills come down close to the road, and there's nowhere to pull off and not much to see except the occasional ranch gate. We'd been talking comfortable car trip talk, and at some point I noticed my wife had gone quiet. Not asleep, I glanced over and she was awake, but she was looking out the passenger window with a particular expression I'd seen on her face before in other situations. And I asked what was wrong, and she said nothing. She was fine. She just wanted to quiet down for a bit, which was fine. We drove in silence. About 20 minutes later, she said, "Do you hear that?" I said, "Hear what?" She said a noise from outside the car, keeping pace with us. I rolled down my window a couple of inches and listened. I heard the road and the wind and the ocean below, and I started to say I didn't hear anything, and then I did. A sound running alongside the car. Not the ocean, not wind, not a mechanical sound from the vehicle. A sound like breathing, rhythmic, slow, slightly below what you'd expect from a person at rest. And it was moving with the car, not passing us, not falling back, keeping pace. I rolled the window back up. We looked at each other. She said she'd been hearing it for 20 minutes and hadn't said anything because she'd been trying to decide if she was imagining it. I did not say to her that I thought she was imagining it because I just heard it myself. I accelerated. The sound accelerated with us. I went from 50 to 70 and the sound stayed with us. No lag, no effort, just pace matching. And at 70, there's nothing alive that runs alongside a car on a coastal highway without eventually falling behind. Nothing. I slowed down to under 30, which on that stretch felt insane because you wanted to be moving. The sound slowed too. I drove at 30 for maybe a mile, and the breathing was right there outside my window. Slow and steady, not taxed by the pace change, just there. And then I sped back up to highway speed, because I couldn't stand the 30 anymore. And the sound stayed for another few miles, and then was simply not there. No fade, just gone. The way the humming stopped in the Smokies account I'd heard about on this channel, between one moment and the next. We didn't speak about it for about an hour. When we did, she said she'd had the whole 20 minutes before she told me to convince herself it was a known sound and she'd failed. She said it had the regularity of something alive, not mechanical. The slight variation in rhythm you get from a living thing breathing. not the perfect metronomic evenness of a machine. She said it hadn't felt threatening, just present, the way a large animal running alongside you might feel if it wasn't interested in you as prey, just running with you for a while. I wanted to describe what the experience of hearing it was like from the driver's seat, because my wife and I had slightly different experiences of it. From where I was sitting with the window cracked, the breathing had a spatial quality. It was clearly to my left, outside the car, at a position roughly level with the driver's door mirror. Not above, not below, not behind. Alongside at that specific height. The consistency of position was what told me it wasn't wind interacting with the car body, because wind sounds move around depending on speed and angle, and this didn't. It stayed at the same position relative to the car, the way a sound source stays in the same position if you're moving at the same speed as the source. It was breathing next to my door mirror for 20-some miles, and then it wasn't. The absence of the sound when it stopped was startling in the same way that a noise, stopping in a quiet room, is startling. Your brain had been accommodating it, and suddenly there was a gap where it had been. My wife's experience from the passenger side was less spatial and more tonal. She said she mostly perceived it as an addition to the background sound of the drive, a layer that didn't belong, and that the reason she didn't tell me sooner was that she'd spent 20 minutes applying every explanation she had to it, and none of them fit, and she wasn't ready to say the unexplained thing out loud. She's a physician. She is even more committed to rational explanation than I am, by professional necessity, and she'd sat with something she couldn't explain for 20 minutes before she mentioned it to me. That detail means more to me than my own experience of it. There's one more thing I want to address before I get to the history research, which is the pace matching itself. A lot of people who read accounts like this online focus on the what was it, what's the explanation, and fewer focus on the how, which I think is actually the more interesting question. Whatever was running alongside our car was running alongside our car for 20-some miles at highway speed, and it matched our speed. Not approximately matched, not ran at its own speed and happened to be nearby, matched, in the way that matching requires attention to what you're matching. It was paying attention to us the whole time. That's a quality of presence that I find more significant than the speed or the duration. Something was paying that much attention to us, for that long, in that environment, and the attention was close enough and sustained enough to maintain exact pace through speed changes. And it did this apparently without effort or distress, and at the end it was simply done and gone. I've thought about what kind of attention that is, and the closest analog I can find is the attention of something that belongs in that place, to which our presence was interesting, but not particularly consequential, and which gave us that sustained attention, the way you might give sustained attention to an unfamiliar animal moving through territory, well, with interest and observation, and without intervention. We looked up the history of that stretch of PCH when we got to her parents' house. There were Chumash settlements all along the coast, from Malibu up through San Luis Obispo County and beyond. And that particular stretch had been inhabited for thousands of years before it was a highway, and the hills that come down close to the road are covered in the kind of chaparral that hides things well. I've since done more research than I probably should have, and I want to share one piece of it because it's the only thing I found that maps to the experience without requiring me to invent additional hypotheses. The Chumash had a cosmology that included entities associated with water and the boundary between land and sea, the coast itself as a liminal space where different kinds of being overlapped. The point where ocean meets land was not a boundary in the Chumash understanding, but a zone, a shared territory. And the beings associated with that zone were not purely of one world or another. I'm not a religious person, and I'm not going to claim Chumash spiritual concepts as an explanation for a physics anomaly I experienced on a highway. But when you describe our experience, something moving at a highway speed, alongside the land-sea margin, present for miles, and then simply apparently not interested in us, just running alongside. And then you describe the cosmological understanding of that specific stretch of coast as a place where different categories of beings share territory. The overlap in description is notable. I'll leave it at that. My wife told one colleague about it about 8 months after the trip. She's a physician, as I said, and she chose to tell a colleague who is also a physician, but who also grew up in California and had spent time on the coast. She described the experience clinically, as she would describe any unusual patient presentation. And she said the colleague's response was to listen without the particular expression that doctors develop for managing unusual reports from patients. To listen instead as one professional to another, and then to say, "I've heard about this stretch of coast before." My wife asked what she'd heard. The colleague said she'd had a patient years earlier, a man who had been driving PCH alone in that area on a night drive, who had described a sound running alongside his car that he couldn't account for, and that he described it in almost exactly the same terms my wife was using: the pace matching, the breathing quality, the rhythm of something alive. She said the man had been frightened by it in a way my wife and I hadn't been, had pulled over and sat on the shoulder until it was gone, and that he'd told her because he was unsure whether what he'd experienced was a medical event, a neurological event, something he should be concerned about. She told him she didn't think it was a neurological event, and that people sometimes heard things on long drives in remote areas, which was her professional holding position, and she'd clearly been holding the real version of what she thought ever since. My wife came home from that conversation with the specific expression she has when something has been confirmed from an unexpected direction. And she said, "So it's a known phenomenon on that road." And I said, "Apparently," and we sat with that for a while. A physician's patient, years before, on the same stretch alone, the same sound. Not us, not our trip, not something we'd conjured between us. A known phenomenon. I'm not drawing a direct line. I don't know what was breathing alongside our car for 20-some miles of coastal highway, but something was. And my wife heard it for 20 minutes before she told me, and spent that whole time trying to find a rational answer and coming up empty. And I heard it with my own ears, and it kept pace at 70 miles an hour. Those are the facts I have. I want to add one thing that happened the following year, when we drove the same section of PCH again, because it was relevant. We were on the same stretch, going the same direction, and about 30 miles into it, my wife said quietly, "It's back." I rolled the window down and listened, and it was there. The same sound, the same pace matching, the same position relative to my door. We drove in silence for about 10 minutes, both of us listening. And then she said something I've been thinking about since. She said she thought it ran that stretch of coast regularly, the way animals have territories they range through. She said maybe it ran the whole length of the coast on its own schedule, and we'd hit the same section twice because we were driving the same road on roughly the same timeline. And that the experience of it running alongside the car was just the experience of being in its territory when it happened to be there. The way you might have a deer run alongside the road for a while before it veers off. Just a thing doing its thing in its territory, and we happened to be on the same road at the same time. The sound lasted for about 25 miles that second time, longer than the first. At the end, it stopped the same way, no fade, just gone. My wife said she found it less unsettling the second time. I said I found it more unsettling because the second time confirmed the first time, and confirmed means it's real, and real things have implications. She said she thought the implications were fine. She said running alongside something for 25 miles without incident was a good outcome, and that she'd take it over most alternatives. I think she's right. I'm just not as comfortable as she is with sharing the road. Story 3. I want to tell you about a motel I stayed in outside of Needles, California, on a drive I took from Phoenix to Los Angeles that I've since made several more times and never stopped at that motel again. I want to describe Needles first because the place shapes the account. Needles sits at the California-Arizona border where the Colorado River hits the desert. And it's one of the oldest crossing points in the region. People have been crossing the river at that location for centuries. The railroad came through in the 1880s, Route 66 came through later, and the interstate came through after that. And each of those was laid on the top of what was already there. The town is small and has had hard decades, and the tourist trade that once sustained it has mostly moved to faster highways and bigger towns. And what's left is a town of a few thousand people in serious desert country, with a lot of old infrastructure and a history that goes deep in every direction. I find Needles interesting rather than depressing, which I recognize is easy to say when you're passing through rather than living there. But the point is the depth of the place, the layers of it, which is relevant to the motel and the television in Room 7, California, on a drive I took from Phoenix to Los Angeles that I've since made several more times and never stopped at that motel again. It was late July, and I'd been driving since 6 in the morning, Phoenix time. And by the time I hit Needles, the desert had been doing what the Mojave does in July, which is making you feel like you're driving inside a working oven with nothing but your air conditioning between you and heat death. I'd planned to push through to Barstow, but by 8 in the evening, with the sun finally down and the heat still coming off the pavement in waves, I decided I was too tired to keep going. There's a strip of old motels just east of the interstate interchange in Needles. The kind that have been there since the 50s and haven't changed much since. And I pulled into one that had a vacancy sign on and a price on the board that suggested it was not expecting to be reviewed on major travel sites. The woman at the desk was professional and efficient, and not the strange part. She gave me a key, an actual physical key, not a card, and told me I was in room 7 at the far end of the row. And I drove my car down and brought my bag in. The room was clean. That was the first surprise. Old, yes, the carpet and the fixtures and the television belonging to a specific era, but genuinely clean, which I've learned not to take for granted in roadside motels at this price point. I got a shower and I was in bed by 9, which felt early, but my body had been at temperature for 14 hours and I was done. The motel had a quality I've thought about since, trying to categorize it. It had the feeling of a place that had been continuously occupied for a very long time, not just by guests, but by something more ambient than guests. The walls had the specific patina of many years of desert dust and dry heat, and the presence of people passing through. And there were framed photographs of the road in the room, not the generic landscape photographs you see in chain motels, but specific photographs of the stretch of highway out front, taken at different times of day, in different seasons, accumulated over what must have been decades. Whoever had decorated that room had done it with photographs of the road outside, as if the most interesting thing visible from the motel was also the most appropriate thing to display inside it. I looked at the photographs before I went to sleep, and I noticed they were all of the same section of road, the same angle, shot from the same place, just at different times. Years of the same road, the same light changing on the same asphalt. Old, yes, the carpet and the fixtures and the television belonging to a specific era, but genuinely clean, which I've learned not to take for granted in roadside motels at this price point. I got a shower and I was in bed by 9, which felt early, but my body had been at temperature for 14 hours and I was done. I woke up at some point in the night and the television was on. I hadn't turned it on before bed. I was sure that I'd been in bed and asleep within 10 minutes of lying down, and I hadn't touched the remote. The television was on, and it was showing something I want to describe carefully. It wasn't a channel. There was no channel bug, no programming, no news ticker. It was footage, handheld footage, of a road at night shot from a moving car. Just a road, dark headlights reaching forward Into the desert. Nothing else. No sound. The road in the footage looked like the road I'd been on. The same flat desert two-lane with the same scrub on the sides. And I watched it for a minute before I was awake enough to be properly unsettled by it. And then I turned the television off with the remote and lay back down. In the morning, the television was on again. I was certain I'd turned it off. I remembered the click of the remote, the screen going dark, but it was on. And it was showing the same footage. Road at night from a moving car. Headlights, desert, darkness. No other content. I turned it off again and got up and showered, and when I came out of the bathroom, the television was on again and the footage was running, and I packed my bag in 30 seconds and I left. I want to be precise about what the footage showed because I've thought about it carefully and my memory of it is clear. The road in the footage was a desert two-lane, not an interstate, not the 40, which runs past Needles, but a smaller road, the kind that ran between towns before the interstates, the old Route 66 type of road. It was shot through a windshield, the kind of framing you get with a camera on the dash, and the car was moving at maybe 50 or 55 miles an hour. The headlights reached ahead about 150 feet. The road surface was old, cracked, with the center line faded almost to nothing. On both sides was the standard desert scrub, with occasional larger shapes rock outcroppings, a Joshua tree here and there, nothing definitive. There was a quality to the footage that I noticed even in my half-asleep state, which was that the road seemed familiar in the way that all desert roads feel familiar if you've spent time on them, but that it was also not any specific road I could place. Generic desert night driving on a road that might have been any one of a dozen roads in the Mojave or the Sonoran or the Colorado desert. Whoever had been driving when the footage was shot had been driving a long time on a road that was going somewhere that wasn't immediately visible. At the office, I stopped to return the key, and the woman was at the desk again, same woman, and I asked her about the television in room 7. I described what I'd seen. She listened without expression, the way people listen when they've heard a version of the same thing before, and then she said that the set in room 7 had done that for as long as she'd worked there, and that maintenance had looked at it and couldn't find a cause, and that she was sorry for the disruption, and that I wouldn't be charged for the night. She said it in the tone of a standard service industry apology, not the tone of someone apologizing for something that frightened them. I asked her what the footage was of, what road it showed, and she said she didn't know. It was just a road. I asked if other guests had mentioned it, and she looked at me with a very slight adjustment of expression, not quite a smile, not quite anything, and said occasionally, "Before I tell you what I've concluded, I want to tell you more about the woman at the desk, because I've thought about her as much as I've thought about the footage." When she said room 7 had done that, as long as she'd worked there, she was reporting a duration, a specific span of years, during which the phenomenon had been a known constant of the room. I asked her how long she'd worked there, and she said 19 years. 19 years of whatever was in that television. I asked her whether it had ever done anything other than the footage gone static, showed regular channels, done anything a malfunctioning television would do, and she said no, it only showed the footage. Maintenance had verified the television was receiving signal, had verified the cable connection, had replaced parts, had eventually replaced the television entirely a few years back. And after the replacement, the footage was still there. She said the new television showed the same footage the old one had. Same road, same night, same loop. That detailed the new television showing the same footage is the one I keep going back to. A malfunctioning television shows its malfunction in the hardware. A replaced television starts fresh. What she was describing was footage that persisted through hardware replacement, which is not a property of any television I know of. The footage is not in the television. The footage is in something else, something that uses whatever display is available in that room, and the 19 years she mentioned is not the duration of the television's malfunction. It's the duration of her knowledge of the footage. The footage may have been running much longer. I've thought about the footage often. The footage was of a night drive on a desert road, shot from inside a moving car, and it ran in a loop. I don't know how long the loop was because I never watched it long enough to see it repeat. I don't know whose footage it was, or how it got into the television in room 7 of that motel, or why the television kept coming back to it. What I know is that I was driving a desert road at night, and I stopped in a room that showed footage of someone else driving a desert road at night. And the footage was the kind of footage that would only mean something to someone who'd been doing what I'd been doing, and I don't know what to do with that. About a year after the trip, I did some research on the road in the footage, the old Route 66 type road, and I eventually found something that might be relevant or might be coincidence. There was, running alongside the current Route 40 corridor near Needles, an older road alignment from the Route 66 era that was mostly decommissioned and unmaintained. Sections of it still visible from the air as faint tracks through the desert. Parts of it had been the National Trails Highway before that, and parts of the National Trails Highway had followed even older routes going back to wagon roads and pack trails. The motel was old enough to have predated the interstate to have been built when one of those older alignments was the main road. It was possible, in other words, that the footage in the television in room 7 was footage of a road that had run directly in front of the motel. The road that the motel had been built to serve, before it was bypassed by later infrastructure. The road the motel watched before the road it currently watches. I went back once, about 6 months later. Not to stay, I drove past the motel in the afternoon and stopped in the parking lot. The motel was still there, still operating, still with the vacancy sign and the price on the board. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes and thought about room 7 and the television and the footage of the road and the woman's flat, professional apology and the way she'd said occasionally when I asked if other guests had mentioned it. I've thought about the photographs on the wall, the ones of the road, years of the same stretch of highway at different times of day. It occurs to me now in a way it didn't at the time, that someone had stood in that room and taken photographs of that road for years, accumulating them, framing them, displaying them. Either the same person across years or successive people continuing the same project. The road outside the window, documented across time. And in the television, footage of a road at night running on a loop. I think now that the motel and the room and whatever mechanism runs the footage in room 7 are all aspects of the same thing, which is a deep interest in the road. An ongoing record of it, a watching of it across years. I don't know who's watching or why. I don't know whose footage it is or how long it's been running, but I think there's something at that motel that has been paying very close attention to the road in front of it for a very long time, and that putting a guest in room 7 is, from its perspective, just another way of watching. There's one more thing, the smallest thing, that I want to put on record, because it's the detail that I've never been able to stop thinking about. And it's not about the television or the footage or the room. It's about the photographs on the wall. I said they were photographs of the same stretch of road, taken from the same position over many years. Years of someone standing in that room and photographing the road. What I didn't say, because I didn't fully register it at the time, and only thought about it later, was that some of those photographs were at night. Not all of them there were dawn photographs, midday photographs, dusk. But several of them were nighttime photographs of the road, taken from inside the room, the road visible through the window in the dark, with headlights from passing cars catching the pavement in long streaks. Someone had stood in that room at night, over many years, and photographed the road as it passed in the dark. The same road that was in the television, the same night road captured in different ways through the window in photographs, on the television in footage as if the room were devoted to the long accumulation of a single subject, the road at night, documented from a fixed position over however many years the motel had been there. I've thought about who did that. I've thought about what it means to stand at a window for years, photographing a road at night. And I've thought about the footage on the television, which was taken from inside a car on the road, not from a window beside the road, as if someone had left the window position and gone out onto the road itself to get closer, to document it from the inside rather than the outside, and that the footage was what that attempt produced. I don't know if that's right, but the room had spent years looking at the road, and the television had footage of being on the road. And I was a person who'd been on the road and stopped for the night, and I think the room was showing me its subject in the only language it had, which was the footage. And I think that's the most complete explanation I'm going to get. I've made the Phoenix to LA run 4 more times. I stop in Barstow. Now, story 4. My grandfather drove truck for 30 years, refrigerated freight running the Central Valley routes that most people don't know exist. The farm to distribution center roads that cut through the ag land between the 5 and the 99. He retired in 1994, and he died 3 years ago at 87. And he was not a man who told stories for effect. He was economical with language in the way that men who work physical jobs often are. He said what needed saying and left out the rest. So when he told me this story, which he told me only once about 15 years ago, sitting on his back porch in Fresno after most of the family had gone home from a Sunday dinner, I listened and didn't interrupt and didn't push him, because the fact that he was telling it at all meant it had been sitting with him for a long time, and he'd decided it was time to say it. He was running a route through the southern San Joaquin in the early 1970s, night run, which he did regularly, the farm roads being better without the ag equipment traffic. He was somewhere on one of the county roads, between Tulare and Visalia, a road he'd driven 100 times, dead straight for miles through the orchard country. And he was making good time in the dark, with the windows down, and the summer air coming in off the fields. I want to tell you what the San Joaquin Valley looks like in the dark, because this part of it tends not to be what people picture when they think of California. The Central Valley is agricultural land on an enormous scale, a flat basin 200 miles long between the Coast Ranges and the Sierra, and the fields go to the horizon in every direction, row crops and orchards, and at night, the scale of the flatness becomes abstract in a way that's hard to describe. You can see weather systems building over the Sierra 40 miles east. The irrigation canals run alongside the roads, and in summer the smell of the water and the crops is specific and complex, and has no other analog. My grandfather drove those roads for 30 years, and he loved the valley the way people love places they've worked in, practically and without sentimentality. And he knew every county road and every irrigation lateral and every orchard gate in his territory. He told me once that the valley at 3 in the morning in August was its own country, separate from the daylight country, and that most people who thought they knew the valley had never seen the 3 a.m. version of it. He said it the way he said most things, as information, not as an invitation to romanticize it. He was a practical man, and the practical version of the valley at 3 a.m. was what he was driving in when he saw the first one. Night run, which he did regularly, the farm roads being better without the ag equipment traffic. He was somewhere on one of the county roads between Tulare and Visalia, a road he'd driven 100 times, dead straight for miles through the orchard country, and he was making good time in the dark, with the windows down and the summer air coming in off the fields. He said he saw a man standing in the road, not on the shoulder, not at the edge, standing in the road, in his lane, facing him. He said he was on him fast enough that he had to brake hard, and he came to a stop with the man still in front of the truck, lit up by his headlights, maybe 30 feet ahead. And the man was just standing there. My grandfather said he sat there with his heart going and looked at this man in the headlights, and the man looked back at him and didn't move, didn't raise his hands, didn't step aside, just stood in the road and looked at the truck. My grandfather said the man was dressed like a farm laborer, jeans, a work shirt, boots, and that he was young, maybe 20, 25, and that everything about him was physically normal, except for the expression, which my grandfather described as blank, in a way that didn't match the situation. He said if someone had just nearly been hit by a truck, they'd show something in their face, fear or anger or relief. And this man showed nothing. He stood in the headlights with an empty face and looked at the truck. After maybe 30 seconds, my grandfather honked his horn. The man didn't react to the horn. My grandfather opened his door, which he said in retrospect was a decision he can't explain, and called out asking if the man was all right, if he needed help. The man turned his head slightly, as if listening, as if the sound of my grandfather's voice was information but not a communication. And then he stepped off the road to the left and walked into the orchard and was gone. No flashlight, no sound of his feet on the ground that my grandfather could hear over the truck's engine, just turned and went into the dark between the trees. My grandfather sat for a few minutes, and then he drove on. He told one other driver about it the next time he was at the distribution center, and the driver looked at him and said, those roads had always had that, and that you just drove past when it happened and you didn't get out of the truck. He said it like it was established procedure. My grandfather never got out of a truck again when someone was standing in the road. He said he'd seen the same thing twice more in his 30 years of driving those roads. Always the same, a young man standing in the lane at night, blank expression, step off the road after a moment, gone into the crops. He said the second and third times he'd done what the other driver said, just driven around slowly and kept going. And both times the figure had stepped off without incident. He said he thought about the first time, getting out and calling out, and he said the thing that bothered him wasn't the figure stepping off. It was the slight turn of the head when he'd called out. The head had moved toward the sound of his voice. He said whatever it was had registered his voice. He said in 50 years of thinking about it, he'd never fully decided if that was better or worse than if it hadn't. My grandfather did tell me 2 more things on that porch before he changed the subject. And I want to put both of them down because they're the parts I think matter most. The first was about the third time he'd seen one. He said the third time was different because it wasn't in the road, it was in the orchard, maybe 15 feet back from the road, standing between the trees, visible because his headlights swept across it as he came around the gentle bend in the road. He said he saw it for less than a second, in the sweep of the lights, and what he saw was that it was standing between the rows, looking toward the road, in the same way the others had looked at the road, with that same blank attention. He said the difference was that this one was looking toward the road, as if it was watching for something, not standing in the road as if it had decided to interrupt traffic. He said this made him think, in the years since, that they might not always be in the road as an obstacle or a test. That sometimes they might be in the road simply because the road is where the people are, and that what they were doing was the same thing my grandfather had been doing all those years, making their circuit, covering their territory, going between the places that mattered. The second thing he told me was that in 30 years of driving those routes, he'd never told anyone in his family. He said his wife would have worried and the company would have questioned his license, and the other drivers would have given him the cold case solved look that people give when they've decided someone's mind is unreliable. He said the only reason he was telling me now was that he was old enough not to care what anyone thought, and that he'd decided someone in the family should know, because if I ever drove those roads and saw the same thing, he'd want me to know, not to get out of the truck. He didn't tell me what he thought it was. I didn't ask. Before he changed the subject, he said one more thing, which I've thought about every time I've driven any part of the Central Valley at night since. He said that in the last few years before he retired, when he was still running the southern San Joaquin routes, he'd made a practice of something that he hadn't told anyone else about. He said that when he was on the roads at night and he felt the kind of awareness that meant there was something in the dark around the truck, not the specific events he described, but the lower level ambient awareness of the country, having things in it that the country always had, he would say something out loud. Not a prayer, not anything formal, just a statement. He'd say he was working, he was just passing through. He meant no harm. and he was going about his business, same as usual. He'd be off the road by dawn. He said he'd been doing it for the last 10 years of his career, and that it had felt right, the way a courtesy feels right, even when you're not sure the other party can hear it. He said it didn't stop what he saw on those roads, the figures, the awareness, but it changed how the seeing felt. It felt more like passing someone on the street and acknowledging them, and less like trespassing on something that hadn't been asked about. He said the valley at 3 in the morning had always had things in it that the daylight country didn't discuss, and that he'd decided to discuss it. He thought that was the decent thing. There's one detail from the porch conversation that I saved because I wasn't sure how to place it, and I've decided it goes at the end. When my grandfather was describing the first time, the man in the road who turned his head toward the sound of my grandfather's voice, he described the conditions of that morning in more detail than I've given you. He said it was about 3:30 in the morning, the dead hour, and the valley was doing what it does at that hour in summer, which is sweating its stored heat out into the cooling air. The specific humid warmth that comes up from the irrigated fields and the drainage canals when the temperature finally starts to drop. He said the smell of the night air at 3:30 in August in the Tulare Visale country was one of the most specific things he knew. Warm water and crops and the faint chemical sweetness of fertilizer and the dark earth beneath everything. And that he'd driven in that smell for 30 years. And it still stopped him sometimes when it was exactly right. When the mix was exactly the way it was on the best nights. He said the man in the road stood in that air. He stood in it the same as my grandfather was in it. Both of them in the 3:30 August Valley. Both of them in the specific smell and the warm and the dark. My grandfather said that was the part that had made him feel, eventually, that the right word for what he'd seen wasn't supernatural. He said the man was in the same night as him, in the same air, in the country both of them knew. He said it was more like meeting someone on a road they had as much right to be on as you did, on a night that belonged to both of you equally, and that the head turning toward his voice was the acknowledgement of that shared territory. The same acknowledgement he'd given back by calling out, and that what had happened on that road at 3:30 in the morning was not a haunting but a meeting between a truck driver and something else in the shared territory of the summer valley dark. He poured himself another glass of iced tea and looked out at his backyard and changed the subject, and I let him. Some things a person tells you because they've been carrying it and need to set it down somewhere, not because they want to talk about it. I've been carrying it for him since because he's gone and someone should. But I want to add one thing about what it meant that he chose the back porch of his house on a Sunday evening in his 80s to finally say it. He'd driven those routes from the early 1970s until 1994, 20-some years of night runs through the southern San Joaquin. In that whole span, he told one other person, the driver at the distribution center, who'd said those roads always had that and you just drove past. And that person had given him the operational guidance and nothing more. He'd been alone with the full weight of it for decades. The 3 sightings and the head turn and the 30-year practice of saying his piece to the night air when the awareness came up. He'd carried it the way he carried everything, without complaint and without drama and without sharing it with anyone who'd have been worried by it. And at the end, when he was old enough to set down the heaviest things, he set it down with me. I think about what it took to hold a thing that long. Not in a tortured way. He wasn't tortured by it. It was in the hay price voice, flat and factual. The way he held all the real things, but in the sense of what it means to know something about the world you live in that the world doesn't officially acknowledge. And to keep going about your business anyway, to keep making the runs, to keep being courteous to what you encountered, to keep the practice alive through 20 years of night driving until there was someone to pass it to. He was a patient man. He was a decent man. He knew the valley at 3 in the morning the way few people ever will, in all its versions, including the version it doesn't show in daylight. And he respected both versions equally. And he went about his business in both versions with the same flat competence. And that is the whole of what I have from him, and the whole of what I'm carrying. I've been carrying it for him since, because he's gone, and someone should. I've understood in the years since that back porch conversation, which is that my grandfather choosing to tell me was not simply about unburdening himself, though that was part of it. He also chose a specific person. Of the family, he chose me, and I've thought about why. And I think it's because he'd watched me long enough to know that I'd hold it without either dismissing it or making too much of it. That I'd carry it at the right weight. He'd spent 30 years carrying it at the right weight himself, acknowledging what he'd seen without building a religion around it, incorporating it into his understanding of the valley and the roads, without letting it change the work or the route or the rhythm of the driving. He wanted to pass on not just the account, but the approach, the courtesy he'd developed, the matter-of-fact acknowledgement, the practice of saying he was just passing through and meaning no harm. He was teaching me something as much as telling me something. And what he was teaching me was that the Central Valley at 3 in the morning has always had things in it that the daylight version doesn't discuss, and that the right response over the long term was not fear and not familiarity, but the specific respectful acknowledgement that you give to something that has as much right to be there as you do. That's what I carry. I've been carrying it for him since, because he's gone, and someone should. If tonight's accounts are doing it for you, hit subscribe before you forget. It's the simplest thing that keeps this channel going. And if you've got something from your own time out there, the address is in the description. I read everything that comes in. Back to the submissions. Story 5. I need to preface this by saying I'm a skeptic by training. I have a degree in electrical engineering. I work in the semiconductor industry. And my natural inclination when confronted with something strange is to look for the mechanism. I say this because I want you to understand that I spent a long time working through mechanisms for what happened on my road trip last summer. And I'm not writing to you because I've run out of ideas. I'm writing because the mechanism that best fits all of the observed facts is one I'm not comfortable publishing under my own name on any platform where my colleagues might see it. And this channel seemed like the right place to put it. I need to give a little technical context before I describe what happened, because the technical context is what makes the behavior anomalous rather than explainable. I work in semiconductor design, and I've spent my career thinking about the behavior of complex systems. And one of the foundational things about complex systems is that you can describe behavior accurately at the functional level without knowing the underlying mechanism, and that accurate functional description is itself useful data, even when the mechanism is unknown. I'm applying that framework here. I'm going to describe the behavior I observed, and I'm going to tell you that the behavior doesn't match any known vehicle operation mode. And I'm going to leave the mechanism open because I don't have one. My girlfriend and I drove from San Jose down to Palm Springs the long way, through Big Sur and down the coast, and then inland through the Carrizo Plain and down into the desert. We'd done ambitious road trips before, and this was a good one. 5 days, and nothing strange happened until the last night. I want to describe the 62 corridor specifically, because I think the setting is part of the account. The 62 runs east from the Coachella Valley, through the high desert to 29 Palms, and then into the Mojave. And at night it's one of those California roads where the darkness is complete in a way that the valley and coastal roads never achieve. The development thins out fast, east of Palm Desert, and within 10 miles you're in dark that goes to the mountains in every direction. With the Joshua trees as the only vertical structure, and the stars overhead doing what desert stars do, which is to establish scale in a way that makes everything at ground level feel very small and very temporary. The road itself is good, maintained, not a wilderness two-track, it's a real highway, speed limit 65, a road that people drive at night all the time. But the country it runs through at night is genuinely empty in a way that most roads in this state aren't. And I think that quality of emptiness is part of what the account is about. Because whatever was behind us was using the emptiness the way things use emptiness, operating in the space where there was no other traffic to provide context or competition. And then inland through the Creosote Plain and down into the desert. We'd done ambitious road trips before, and this was a good one. 5 days, and nothing strange happened until the last night. We were somewhere on the 62, the highway that runs east from the Coachella Valley into the high desert toward 29 Palms around 11 at night, coming back to our hotel after dinner. The road at that hour is almost empty and it runs through dark desert, with the occasional lit-up property set back in the brush. I was driving. My girlfriend was looking at her phone. Completely normal. I became aware of lights behind me. A vehicle had come up fairly close, not dangerously, just road companion close. Another car heading the same direction in the dark. I glanced in the rear view and registered headlights and didn't think about it. A few minutes later, I looked again, and the vehicle was still there, same distance. Then I started paying attention to it properly, because the distance was too consistent. On an empty 2-lane at night, following distance tends to vary. You speed up a bit. They speed up. One of you brakes for a curve, and there's a natural drift in spacing. This vehicle's spacing was not drifting. It was holding exactly the same interval behind me, regardless of what I did with the accelerator. I tested it. I slowed to 45. The vehicle slowed to 45. I sped up to 70. It sped up to 70. I varied between speeds several times over about 10 miles, and the interval didn't change by more than a car length. This is not normal driving behavior, even for someone tailgating. Tailgaters speed up when you slow down, close the gap. This was interval matching, not following. It was maintaining the exact same distance, the way a driver assist system maintains following distance, not the way a human drives. I told my girlfriend. She turned around and looked at the lights, and she watched for a while, and she said, "Yeah, it's not changing." She got her phone out and started timing it. Over 9 minutes of variable speed on my part, the interval stayed within 1 car length. Not because we were going at consistent speed, we weren't. I was changing speed deliberately. But because whatever was behind us was responding to our speed changes within seconds, which on a dark road with normal reaction times is not possible for a human driver who can only see us by our tail lights. And then I pulled over. I just pulled off onto the shoulder. The vehicle behind us slowed and stopped, about 50 yards back. I couldn't make out anything beyond the headlights. We sat on the shoulder for 2 minutes, and the vehicle sat 50 yards behind us with its lights on and didn't approach. Then I pulled back onto the road and continued, and the vehicle continued at the same interval. This went on until we turned into the hotel parking lot. The vehicle did not turn. It continued on the 62 eastbound, and its lights diminished in my rear view and were gone. I sat in the hotel parking lot for a while, trying to work through it. The mechanism that fits the data is a vehicle under some kind of automated control, maintaining a precise following distance, which as a description of observable behavior is fine. It's accurate, but it raises more questions than it answers. What kind of vehicle? Whose? Why? Why on this road at night? Why, when we pulled over, did it stop and wait rather than continuing or approaching? The interval matching I can give a technical name to. The behavior in aggregate, the following and the stopping and the waiting and the resuming and the turning away at the hotel, that behavior's purposeful in a way that I can't fit into any framework that's professionally comfortable for me. I want to add the thing that happened when I pulled into the hotel parking lot, because I left it out in my first telling and it belongs in the account. When I turned off the car in the parking spot, I had a thought that I'm going to describe precisely because the precision matters. I had the thought that whatever had been following us had turned away at the hotel, because hotels are registered, documented, named places, and that it had followed us while we were between places, in the unnamed space of the highway in the dark, and had stopped when we arrived somewhere that had a record of us. The thought arrived fully formed, not as a conclusion I'd reasoned to, but as a kind of intuition about the behavior. and I'm including it not as a theory, but as data, as something my mind produced in response to the behavior pattern. I don't know if it's right, but it fits the behavioral description better than anything else I've generated. Something that operates in the spaces between places, that follows movement rather than destinations, that stops when the movement resolves into arrival. My girlfriend and I talked about it the next morning. She's in material science, and her instinct was similar to mine, to describe the behavior accurately and leave the mechanism open. She said the behavior was consistent with monitoring rather than pursuing maintaining a specific interval, the way a monitoring device maintains calibrated distance, stopping when the monitored thing stops. She said whatever word you use for the thing doing the monitoring vehicle, entity, system, the monitoring behavior itself was coherent and internally consistent, and that coherent, consistent behavior implied intent of some kind. She said she found the implied intent more unsettling than if it had just been erratic, because erratic can be mechanical, but consistent following and stopping and waiting and resuming and turning away is a sequence of decisions. She said that at 11 at night on the 62, she didn't know whose decisions those were, and she didn't want to find out. I want to add one thing about what happened on the drive home from Palm Springs the next morning, which was through the same section of the 62. We drove it in daylight, normal traffic, nothing unusual. I was watching for the vehicle from the night before, not expecting to find it, just alert to the possibility, and I didn't see anything that matched. Daylight on that road is completely ordinary. The desert looks like desert. The traffic behaves the way traffic behaves. The properties along the road look like properties along the road. There's nothing about the road in daylight that would suggest anything unusual about it. My girlfriend said something on the drive home that I've thought about since. She said the behavior we'd experienced was most consistent with something that operated in conditions of low ambient light and sparse traffic conditions, under which tracking behavior could proceed without interference. She said in daylight, in traffic, the road was crowded enough, and the observation opportunities were poor enough that the behavior wouldn't make sense. She said this clinically, as if she were describing a sensor system's operating parameters, and then she looked at me and said, "I'm just describing the behavior, I'm not claiming I know what it is," and I said, "I know." And we drove the rest of the way home in a comfortable silence that had something carefully unsaid in it that we both preferred to leave unsaid. One more thing, because I think it's genuinely useful for people who've had similar experiences. The framework I've been struggling with throughout this account, the functional description without the mechanism, has one significant implication that I keep coming back to. If the behavior I observed is monitoring behavior, if it's something maintaining a calibrated following distance and responding to our movements with purpose, then whatever is doing the monitoring is getting information about us and processing it fast enough to respond, which means it understands something about vehicles and speed and road geometry. Whether that understanding comes from millions of years of watching things move through terrain, or from something that has learned to read the specific patterns of vehicle traffic on desert highways at night, or from something I don't have a category for, the functional capability is the same. It can track, it can follow, it can maintain a relationship with a moving vehicle over time. I find this less frightening than I might, and the reason I find it less frightening is the part where it turned away at the hotel. If the behavior is purposive, if it follows, because following is what it's doing, then the stopping at the hotel means the purpose was satisfied or suspended or completed by our arrival. We got where we were going, and the following was over. I've been on the road many times since, and I've been on the 62 specifically, and nothing has followed me again, or if it has, it hasn't done so in a way I noticed. I pay attention now in a way I didn't before, but I'm not frightened. I'm just more aware that the road at night, particularly the desert road at night, has its own traffic, and that sometimes the other traffic notices you. I haven't told my colleagues. I'm telling you because this channel is where I put the things I can't file properly. Story 6. Okay, so this is embarrassing to admit because I was 22 and I thought I was tougher than I was. And the embarrassment is actually part of the reason I'm writing it down, because I want to be honest about what happened. And part of what happened is that I was genuinely terrified in a way I'd never been before or since. And I think that's worth including, even if it makes me look like less of a tough guy. I was driving from Redding down to Sacramento on I-5 night drive. Just me, December, coming home from visiting a college friend for a week. I want to say something about I-5 at night in winter, because it's the context and it matters. The Sacramento Valley section of I-5, from Redding south, is a strange highway in the dark, wide, well-maintained, and surrounded by valley flatness that has an absorbing quality at night. The kind of drive where the road and the dark are so consistent that your mind starts to lose the edges between itself and the driving, which is a known and documented cognitive phenomenon that truckers and long-haul drivers manage with specific strategies. I was managing it fine. I'd done this drive before and I knew the cognitive territory, and I was alert. I'm saying this because what I'm about to describe did not happen to a person who wasn't paying attention. I was paying close attention. I'd been paying close attention to the car beside me for 10 minutes before I looked at its interior. I was driving from Redding down to Sacramento on I-5. Night drive, just me, December, coming home from visiting a college friend for a week. It was rainy, not hard, just the steady Northern California winter drizzle that makes everything greasy. Traffic was light. I had the radio on. I was going about 65 in the middle lane, which was reasonable for the conditions, and everything was as boring as a nighttime I-5 run is supposed to be. I noticed a car in my left lane that I want to describe carefully. It was keeping pace with me, which cars do. Standard dark sedan, nothing distinctive. What I noticed first wasn't the car. It was my own behavior. I'd started to speed up slightly. Not consciously, it's just the way you sometimes do when you become aware of another car pacing you and your foot responds without instruction. I got up to about 73, and the car in the left lane was still there, still keeping pace. I moved to the right lane to let it pass, and instead of passing it, moved into the middle lane and was beside me again. I moved back to the left lane. It moved to the right lane and was alongside. I tried this 3 more times with the same result, whatever lane I was in. It was in the adjacent lane, keeping exact pace, never pulling ahead, never falling back. By this point, I was up to 80, and I had both hands on the wheel, and I was trying not to show that this was getting to me. The way you try not to show fear even when you're alone in a car, because the trying is how you keep the fear from being real. I looked over at the car. The driver's side window was right there, in rain and highway darkness. And the interior of the car was dark, the way interiors are dark at night when there's no internal light source. Not perfectly dark. You can usually make out a shape, a head, a silhouette against the far windows, and I looked over and there was nothing in the driver's seat. Not a very short person, not someone slouched down. The seat was empty. The car was driving itself down I-5 at 80 miles an hour in the rain at midnight, keeping perfect pace with me and mirroring my lane changes, and there was no driver. I floored it. I went to 95, which on a wet I-5 in December was a genuine act of desperation, and I held it there, and the car did not keep up. I watched it fall back in my mirror, and I kept going, and I went to the next exit, the first one I hit, and I pulled off and I sat in a parking lot outside a fast food place that was closing up for the night, and I sat there for 20 minutes before I could make myself go back on the road. I told my parents about it when I was home for Thanksgiving that year, which surprised me because I don't usually tell my parents things that make me look unstable, but I was still unsettled enough that I needed to say it to someone with no stake in my professional reputation. My father listened carefully the way he always listens, and then he said something I didn't expect. He said that when he'd driven that stretch of I-5 in the 60s and 70s, before I was born, there were stories about it. He said the Valley Freeway at night had a different reputation in those days when it was newer and less traveled, and that drivers talked about things on it the way they talked about other long-haul highways. The way things found the long, empty stretches of interstate at night in a way they didn't find busier roads. He said he'd never seen anything himself, but that he'd heard accounts from other drivers that he dismissed at the time. He said he wasn't dismissing them anymore. My mother's response was different. She said, "Did you get home okay?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Then you were fine," and changed the subject, which is her consistent approach to things she's decided are outside her jurisdiction. I think she has the better framework of the two of them, actually. The car was there. It followed me. It didn't hurt me. I got home fine. Whatever it was and whatever it wanted, the outcome was that I got home. That's a fact worth noting. Most of the things on these roads, the things people report, let you go. Whatever they're doing, they let you go. I've told this to 3 people. 2 of them explained it to me. One said maybe the driver was there, and I just couldn't see them in the dark and rain. The other said maybe the car was on some early cruise control and the driver had slumped out of my line of sight. Both of which I've considered, and neither of which accounts for the behavior, the mirroring of my lane changes, the exact pace matching, the response to speed changes. A car on cruise control going a constant speed does not mirror your lane changes. And a car with a driver who's asleep or incapacitated doesn't hold a perfect course in the rain at highway speed while tracking your lane changes across 3 lanes. Let me describe the empty seat in more detail because I know what someone who hasn't had this experience will think, which is that I must have missed the driver in the dark. I've thought about this at length, and I want to explain why the empty seat reading was not a misperception. When a car is occupied, there are visual cues that persist even in darkness, the silhouette of the seat being subtly depressed at the occupant position, the slight variation in how the far windows appear because of the body mass in the car. None of those cues were present in what I saw. The seat profile was flat. The interior read the way an interior reads when no one is in it, not the way it reads when someone is there, but dark. I've been a passenger in cars at night, and I know the difference between a dark interior with a person in it and a dark interior without one. And what I saw was an interior without anyone in it. The seat was empty and had been empty, I believe, the whole time the car had been beside me. Whatever was causing the car to run at my speed and mirror my lane changes was not a human driver. The third person I told didn't explain it. They said they'd heard about driverless cars on I-5 before, people seeing them at night, and they said it like it was a known thing. And I said, "What does that mean, like company cars being tested?" And they said, "No, not exactly like that." And they didn't say what they meant by not exactly like that, and I didn't push them, because by then I decided I preferred my uncertainty to whatever they were going to say. I want to add one last thing, which is that the behavioral pattern has a name in a context I didn't expect to find it. About a year after it happened, I described the behavior to someone who worked in autonomous vehicle development. The interval matching, the lane mirroring, the stop and wait response. And they said that's a following protocol. That's design behavior. And that every self-driving system under development has a version of it. I said yes, that's what it looked like, and asked whose vehicle it could have been. And they said none. Not on a public road in December in the rain. Nothing with that capability existed on California roads at that time in any authorized test program they knew of. They said if the behavior was as I described, it was something running a following protocol without being a product they recognized. And they looked at me with the carefully level expression of someone deciding not to say the next thing they were thinking. I thanked them and we changed the subject. I've thought about the word unauthorized ever since and about what it implies, and about a dark sedan running a perfectly calibrated following protocol on the I-5 in the rain at midnight. as if the rain and the dark and the hour and the highway were its ordinary operating environment. I want to say something about the I-5 at night that isn't in the account yet, which is that the Sacramento Valley section of that highway has a quality in darkness that I think is different from most highways people know. The valley is flat enough and the highway is built high enough on its embankment that at night you're essentially driving on a raised platform above the dark fields. And the effect is that the landscape visible from the road is very different from what you'd see in daylight. In daylight, the valley is vast and organized, the field grid, the orchards, the towns at regular intervals. The whole agricultural apparatus of the state, visible and comprehensible. At night, all of that organization disappears, and what you have is the highway and the darkness and the occasional amber patch of a town at the edge of visibility. And the highway feels less like a road through California and more like a road through an expanse, a thing in itself crossing something much larger than it. That's the quality I mean when I say the valley at night has its own character. The infrastructure that makes it domesticated by day is invisible by night, and you're crossing something wilder than the day version suggests. I think whatever was beside me that night on the I-5 was operating in the night version of the valley, the version without the organized grid, the version that is just the flat darkness and the occasional highway, and the things that move through it without being part of the human traffic. In daylight on the I-5, I've never felt anything unusual. At night, I'm more attentive. The daylight valley and the night valley are different places. Here's what I actually took away from it practically, the behavior change that came out of the experience. I drive differently at night on long, empty highway sections, not frightened differently. I'm not afraid. I've done the drive hundreds of times since, and I'm not afraid, but attentive differently. I pay attention to what's alongside me in a way I didn't before. I notice when something has been beside me for a consistent distance, and I notice when the consistency is too consistent to be normal traffic behavior. I notice when the car beside me slows when I slow and speeds when I speed, because that's the tell, that response without lag to speed changes. I've noticed it twice since that December drive, both times on I-5, both times at night, and both times I did the same thing I did the first time I pulled over. Both times the car beside me slowed and stopped some distance back. Both times I sat on the shoulder for a few minutes and then pulled out and continued. And both times the car was gone or had continued past me. And I couldn't tell which because when you're on the shoulder with your hazards on the traffic behind you is just lights. I've made peace with not knowing. I pay attention, I note what I see, and I drive on. That's the whole of it. Taking a short break from the submissions here. If you've been listening and want to make sure you get the next batch when it drops, hit subscribe. It's the main way this channel keeps going. Comments help too, especially if something in here has landed on you in a particular way. Back to the accounts. Story 7. I drive for a living, long haul, and I've been doing it for 18 years. I run the western routes, mostly California to the Pacific Northwest, California down into the Southwest, and a lot of California interior, the full length of the state. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that this account doesn't come from someone who isn't used to long hours on dark roads, who isn't used to the strange small things that happen when you're alone, in a cab at 2 a.m, running a mountain grade in bad weather. I've seen things that scared me before. This is different because it's the only one I never found a working explanation for, and the only one where the explanation doesn't matter because of the way it ended. I was running the Grapevine, which is what Californians call the stretch of I-5 that goes over the Tayshaun Pass between the San Fernando Valley and the Central Valley. And I want to tell you something about the Grapevine before I tell you what happened, because the road itself is relevant. The Grapevine is one of the oldest continuous travel corridors in California. The pass was used by indigenous people for thousands of years before any road existed, and then by the Spanish, and then by American settlers, and then by the railroad, and then by successive generations of roads. each one on top of or alongside the last. The current I-5 is the latest version of a route that has been carrying people and goods over the Tehachapi Range for as long as people have been moving between the coast and the interior. That kind of continuous use, that depth of traffic across centuries, means the ground under the highway has seen a very great deal of human movement and a very great deal of human distress, because the Grapevine is not a gentle road. And in the years before modern vehicles and road engineering, and even after, it claimed lives. My company's dispatchers had a phrase they used informally, which was that the Grapevine was a toll road in the old sense, meaning you paid for the crossing one way or another. Most people paid in time and fuel and engine wear. Some paid more. The road has that history in it the way some places have their history in them, layered, permanent. Of I-5 that goes over the Tejon Pass between the San Fernando Valley and the Central Valley. It's a steep climb either way, 6% grades, and it closes in bad weather. And I've run it in conditions ranging from fine to genuinely dangerous. This was winter, February, clear and cold. No weather issues, maybe 2 in the morning, heading south into the valley after a run to Sacramento. Light traffic, normal. I was on the long descent coming down into the valley when I saw, far ahead in the southbound lanes, a vehicle stopped in the lane. Not on the shoulder, in the lane. No hazard lights, just a car, sitting still on a 6% grade on the Grapevine at 2 in the morning. I came down on it gradually, the way you come down on things on a mountain grade when you're hauling weight and your stopping distance is not what a sedan's is. And I could see as I got closer that it was a small car, older, and that the lights were off. No hazards, no headlights, no interior light. Just a dark car sitting in the lane. I had to slow to a crawl to get around it in the right lane because there was a car behind me too, and I needed time to see what I was dealing with. As I crept past, I shone my spotlight on it, the cab spotlight I use for road checks, and I could see inside the car. There was a woman in the driver's seat. She was slumped over the wheel, which is what you see with medical events. Cardiac, stroke, seizure, and I know the shape of it. I've called in 2 prior medical events in 18 years on the highway, and I know what a person who's had one looks like in a stopped car. She looked exactly like that. I got on the CB and radioed ahead and got on the phone with 911 and gave them the location. I couldn't stop in the lane safely, and I couldn't stop on the shoulder because there wasn't enough shoulder on that grade. So I kept moving at low speed while I made the calls. Dispatch told me units were coming. I kept going, pulling onto the first available wider shoulder about a half-mile down, and I waited. CHP got there in about 15 minutes. I watched in my mirror and saw the lights stop at the location. I sat there for close to an hour because that's what I do. I stay until I know the situation is resolved. And the CHP unit eventually came down to where I was parked. And the officer told me they hadn't found anything. No car, no woman, no debris, no evidence that a vehicle had been stopped in that lane. He wasn't dismissive about it. He was matter-of-fact, professional. And he took my information and told me the stretch of the Grapevine had reports before of vehicles that weren't there when units arrived. And I asked him what that meant, and he said he didn't know. And he meant it. He wasn't brushing me off. He said the Grapevine had a history of serious accidents, that a lot of people had died on that grade over the decades, and that sometimes reports came in about things in the road that the responding units couldn't find. And he said this with the flat tone of someone reporting a weather pattern, rather than something supernatural, just a known characteristic of that stretch of road. The CHP officer who came down to my truck was thorough and professional, and I want to describe our conversation more fully, because parts of it have stayed with me. After he told me they hadn't found anything, I said I was certain of what I'd seen, certain enough to report it, certain enough that I'd slowed to a crawl getting around it, certain enough that I'd sat on the shoulder for an hour waiting for a resolution. He said he believed me. He said it without any of the careful hedging that people use when they're humoring someone. Just directly, I believe you saw something. And he said that this section of the grapevine had a documented pattern of reports that couldn't be resolved. He said responding units had been sent out to reports on this grade more times than he could count and had found nothing, not just this year, but going back through the records as far as anyone had looked. Not all the reports, he said genuine accidents and breakdowns were the majority, and they were real and they were findable. But there was a subset of reports spread over years of stopped vehicles with occupants in distress called in by credible witnesses that were simply not there when units arrived. He said the grade had a particular stretch, about a mile of the steepest descent, where these reports clustered. He said it was not a surprise to him that my report fit the pattern. I asked him how he thought about that professionally. He said he'd decided the right way to think about it was that the road held something, and that witnesses sometimes saw it, and that the correct response was to send a unit and verify and note the outcome, and that the outcome in these cases was always no vehicle present. But he never once wished he hadn't sent a unit, because you couldn't know in advance which category a report was going to fall into. He said the possibility that the thing was real in some sense didn't change what you did about it, which was respond and verify. He said he thought that was probably the right framework for a lot of things you encounter on a long career on this road. Before I tell you what I think I've come to, I want to describe what the grapevine is actually like for a driver at 2 in the morning in February, because the conditions are the context. The grapevine descent southbound starts about 4 miles before the valley floor and runs down at 6% for most of that, which in a fully loaded truck is a sustained braking operation, not just releasing the accelerator. You're managing heat in the brakes, watching the speed, watching the road, and watching for anything that shouldn't be there, because on a steep grade in the dark, a stopped vehicle in the lane is a serious hazard to an 80,000-pound rig that can't stop in the same distance a car can. I know what it costs to haul on that grade. I know what it costs to brake on that grade. What I did coming down on that February night was slow to the kind of speed where I could have stopped for the car I saw, which is not nothing in a loaded truck on a 6% grade at 2 in the morning. I committed real braking capacity to stopping for that car. I was there enough to give it that. The grade has a history that the people who designed it knew about and built into it. There are runaway truck ramps at several points on both the north and south approaches, the kind of gravel-filled escape ramps that exist because trucks do occasionally lose brake function on steep grades and need somewhere to go. The ramps have been used. People have died on the grapevine in ways that the runaway ramps were designed to prevent and didn't always prevent. The grade is engineered as well as grades can be engineered, and it still claims people, and the CHP knows this, and the dispatchers know this, and the drivers know this, and the mountain knows this, in whatever sense mountains know the things that happen on them. I've been a professional driver for 18 years, and I've made peace with a lot of things that don't make conventional sense. I want to say one thing directly to anyone who drives for a living and is reading or listening to this, because I think it applies to more drivers than me, more routes than the grapevine, more nights than that February. The road at night is not the same road as the road in the day, and treating them as identical is a choice that erases something real. The day road and the night road share the same asphalt and the same geography and the same painted lines and a completely different quality, and the night road has been in use by more than cars for longer than cars have existed. And if you drive long enough, you'll feel that. You'll have your moment on your grade or your flat or your desert stretch where the road shows you its other contents. When that happens, I'd say, stay steady, make your calls, keep your courtesy, and know that the road has been managed by people who knew what it held long before you got on it and left guidance for how to handle it. The CHP officer who told me the road has a pattern was one of those people. My grandfather, who figured out the courtesy on his own over 30 years, was one of those people. The man on the back porch who handed his knowledge to the right person at the right time was one of those people. The guidance exists. You'll find it when you need it, the way I did, in the form it comes in, which is usually a practical person saying a simple thing plainly. Keep moving. Stay on the road. Make the call. Drive on. The road has been doing this longer than any of us, and it will be doing it when we're gone, and respect for that fact is the whole of the practice. I've been a professional driver for 18 years, and I've made peace with a lot of things that don't make conventional sense. The road produces experiences that don't fit into the categories most people have for experience. And if you drive long enough, you either find a way to hold those experiences or you stop driving. I didn't stop driving. What I did gradually, over the years after the Grapevine incident, was develop what I think of as a professional acknowledgement of the road's other contents. The way the CHP officer talked about it as a pattern, a characteristic, something you respond to appropriately without needing to understand. That's the framework I've worked with since. The road has certain properties. Some of those properties are physical and some are not. And both categories require appropriate response. And neither category requires you to have a theory about it. The woman I called in on the Grapevine that night, I've thought about her many times. I've thought about the history the officer mentioned, the accumulated accidents on that grade, the weight of what that road has taken over decades. I've thought about what it means that the reports cluster in a specific section of the grade, a specific mile of steep descent where the combination of grade and curve and history has produced more incidents than adjacent sections. I've thought about whether the woman in the car was a residual image of something that happened on that grade, a specific accident that printed itself into the road strongly enough to be visible under certain conditions, or whether she was something else, something asking for the call to be made, for the situation to be reported, even if nothing could be done about it physically. I don't know the answer, but I made the call and I'd make it again, and the officer who responded didn't think less of me for making it. That's enough, I've decided. You see something on the road that needs reporting, you report it. The road does the rest. I drove the rest of the valley run, thinking about the woman slumped over the wheel and what it meant that she wasn't there when the CHP arrived. I want to tell you what I think about who she was or what she was because I've spent years on it and I should put my working theory on record. The Grapevine has a documented history of serious accidents. And I don't mean recent accidents, I mean the history of the pass itself. From the earliest use of Tejon Pass as a travel route, people have been dying on that grade since before it was a grade. On the steep terrain that preceded the road, the earliest documentation of the pass includes accounts of difficulty, of wagons that couldn't make the descent safely, of the specific hazards of the switchbacks and the grade. By the time the highway came, the pass had been killing people for decades, and the highway made it faster without making it safer for the people who didn't have the equipment to handle it. My company's records of accidents on the Grapevine go back to before I was driving, and I've heard stories from the older drivers about particular incidents, particular spots on the grade where something went wrong, and the concentration of those stories in the mile of steep descent that the CHP officer mentioned as the cluster zone for unresolvable reports is not random. That mile of grade has a specific history of specific incidents. And the woman I saw slumped over the wheel in a car stopped in the lane on that grade is consistent with the type of incident that has recurred on that stretch. I think she's one of them. I think she's part of the history of that grade, a specific accident or a composite of accidents that the road carries in a way I can't explain technically, but can describe functionally. She's there under certain conditions, visible to certain drivers, needing the call to be made. Whether the call does anything practical, whether CHP units responding to an unresolvable report constitutes something meaningful, beyond the physical absence they find, I don't know. But I think calling it in is the right thing, and I think she needed it called in, and I'm glad I did it. I've come to a kind of peace with it that I know won't satisfy everyone and doesn't entirely satisfy me. I think she was real, and I think she needed someone to call it in, and I think I was the one who happened to be there that night to make the call. Whether she was there in any conventional physical sense, I can't say. But I called it in, and I'd call it in again. Story 8. I've been a travel photographer for 12 years, and I've driven every road in the state that goes somewhere worth photographing, which is most of them. I work alone, I camp rough when I have to, I keep strange hours because the light I want is at dawn and dusk, and I spend a lot of time driving between those windows in the flat, dark middle of the night. I mention this because I want you to understand that the road at night is not an unusual environment for me, and that the thing I'm going to tell you happened in a context where I am about as experienced and clear-headed as I get. I want to describe the quality of the light that night specifically because I was professionally paying attention to it. The high desert east of the Sierra in late October has a particular quality after sunset that I've tried to capture for 12 years. With mixed success, the sky goes through several phases of blue and gray, and the stars come in early at that altitude, and the land takes on a density in the dark that's different from how it looks in daylight. The volcanic fields around the Bodie area are black and rough, remnant of eruptions that happened thousands of years ago in Lookit. And in the post-sunset light, they go from brown-black to pure black in a way that makes the land look more ancient than it does in daylight, if that's possible. I've made many photographs on that road and at that hour, and I know the visual vocabulary of that country at night, as well as I know any landscape I've worked in. And I've driven every road in the state that goes somewhere worth photographing, which is most of them. I work alone, I camp rough when I have to. I keep strange hours because the light I want is at dawn and dusk, and I spend a lot of time driving between those windows in the flat, dark middle of the night. I mention this because I want you to understand that the road at night is not an unusual environment for me, and that the thing I'm going to tell you happened in a context where I am about as experienced and clear-headed as I get. I was driving the road from Bridgeport down toward Bodie, and then cutting across to the Mono Lake Basin, a route I'd done for years, late October, the last of the aspen color in the high country. I'd been shooting at Bridgeport for the sunset, and I was heading toward the Mono side when I came through the ghost town, which I always slow down for, even though I've photographed it 100 times, because the light on those old structures after sunset has a quality I can't stop wanting to document. It was full dark by the time I was through Bodie and on the dirt road that cuts across to the highway, about 8 miles of corrugated washboard that I knew well enough to take at a reasonable speed. No other lights anywhere. The sky was doing something extraordinary with stars, the way it does out there above 10,000 feet. Midway across the flat, I saw a light ahead of me. Not a vehicle light the wrong color. Too warm, yellow-orange rather than white or red. A fixed light at ground level, off to the side of the track. As I got closer, I could see it was a lantern, a real oil lantern, hanging from a post, and there was a structure next to it. A small structure, a hut or a shed, and around it some equipment I couldn't immediately identify. I pulled up and stopped, because a photographer is constitutionally incapable of passing a lantern-lit structure in the dark. I got out. The structure was a claim shack, the kind that mining claims use to require you to maintain as proof of active operation, wood plank construction, old, and around it were mining implements, a hand-operated windlass, some timbers over a prospect hole, picks and a couple of buckets. All of it was old. Not decorative antique old. Used and weathered old. The kind you see at Bodie itself. The kind where the tools have the specific surface quality of objects that have been handled 1,000 times by working hands. The lantern was burning, not a battery lantern with a flame effect LED. An oil lantern with a flame giving off the particular warm smell of burning oil. Somebody had filled it recently enough that it was still burning. I photographed all of it, I have the images, and then I stood there in the dark for a few minutes trying to work out where I was and whose this could be. That flat is BLM land. There are no current mining claims in that immediate area that I knew of, and there was no vehicle anywhere, no other person. Nothing that would explain a recently filled and lit oil lantern next to an apparently active claim operation in the middle of nowhere at 9 in the evening in October. I drove onto the highway. I want to tell you about the drive from the flat to the highway that night. After I left the site, because the drive itself was part of the experience, and I left it out. The 8 miles of corrugated dirt from the Bodie flat to the 395 took about 20 minutes in the dark, and I drove it slowly because the road demands it, and I had the photographs on my camera and the lantern-lit structure in my rearview mirror for the first mile before the train folded and hit it. And during that drive, I had a specific quality of feeling that I want to describe accurately, because it's different from what I usually feel coming out of a shoot. Normally, after a good shoot, I feel a kind of satisfied depletion, the specific tiredness of having been fully present for the light and gotten what I came for. What I felt on that dirt road was something different. A sense of having been given something I hadn't asked for and wasn't sure I had the right to. That the structure in the lantern and the open prospect hole and the cot frame in the dark room had not been staged for me or intended for me. And that whatever had been there when I photographed it had not been performing for the camera. I've photographed a lot of things that perform landscapes perform, people perform. Animals perform for the camera, in the sense that your presence changes their behavior. The sight on the flat that night had not changed in response to my presence. The lantern had not brightened when I got out of the car. The structure had not presented itself differently when I raised the camera. It had simply been there, doing what it was doing, and I had been there too. And the photographs were a record of two presences in the same place at the same time, neither of which had changed the other. I found that quality more affecting than I found anything supernatural about it. A place that doesn't change for you is a place that exists for its own reasons. In the morning, I went back. I went back because I am a professional and I had shot the structure in the dark, and I wanted daylight photographs. The structure was not there. No claim shack, no windlass, no equipment, no post where the lantern had hung. I walked the area in a grid, the way I grid a location when I'm not sure of my landmark identification, and there was nothing. Flat scrub, a few rocks, the road ruts. I checked my GPS coordinates from the night before, and I was in the right place. I want to describe the experience of standing next to the structure that night in more detail, because I was there for about 15 minutes, and I want to be accurate about it. The lantern gave off enough light to work by, and I moved around the site doing what I always do, which is looking at things from multiple angles before I raise the camera, because you can't see a composition until you've moved around in the space. The mining equipment was genuine period material, not replica, not museum quality, working life quality, the wear and surface texture of tools that had been used and set down and used again over years. The windlass had rope on it, old rope, the fiber type that was standard before synthetic rope, and the rope had the brittleness of long exposed natural fiber. The prospect hole was real. Timber-lined, the darkness going down at least 15 feet before I lost it with my flashlight. The claim shack had a door that was closed, but not locked, and I opened it. I opened it because I photograph everything. It's reflexive, and inside were more tools and a cot frame and a shelf with cans that were old enough that the labels were the printed tin type that preceded paper labels on canned goods. The interior smelled of old wood and dust and something faintly mineral, the specific smell of a working mine site. I stood in that doorway for a moment, and I took a photograph of the interior. And then I went back outside and took more photographs of the exterior and the lantern and the equipment. And I got back in my car and drove on, I have the photographs from the night before. They're real photographs of a real structure with a real lit lantern. I have photographs from the morning of an empty flat with nothing in it. I've shown them to two people, one of whom helped me go through the historical mining records for that area. And there was a claim on that ground in the 1890s. Worked briefly and abandoned, and the records describe a structure that matches what I photographed. My colleague who helped me with the historical research found, eventually, in the county assessor's records from the 1890s, a description of the claim that matched the location well enough to be the same site, the boundary markers, the prospect hole depth, the structure type. The claimant had worked the site for 2 seasons and then abandoned it without recording the abandonment, which was common. There was no record of what happened to the claimant after the last filing. He had come to the Eastern Sierra with the same ambitions as most, and then disappeared from the record, as many did. My colleague said something when we were going through the records that I've thought about since. She said the claim was never formally closed, that the original filing was still technically active in the county records, because no one had ever filed the paperwork to close it, and that in the precise bureaucratic sense of the term, the claim was still open. It had been open since 1892. She said this with the careful neutrality of an archivist presenting facts, and I received it the same way as a fact, and I've held it alongside the photographs and let them mean what they mean. I've had a career relationship with the photographs from that night that I want to describe because it's unusual for me. I'm a working photographer. I take a lot of photographs. Most of them exist as files on a drive or in a client archive or as prints in someone's collection, and my relationship with my own work is professional and generally non-attached. These photographs are different. I have them printed and framed in my studio, 3 of them, the exterior shot with the lantern, the windlass and the equipment, and the interior through the doorway. They're technically among the better photographs I've taken in the high desert. The quality of oil lamp light and darkness is exceptional for a photographer, and the equipment has a beautiful worn surface quality. I look at them when I'm in the studio in the way that you look at particular photographs, the way certain images have a hold on you that others don't. But I've never shown them in an exhibition, which is unusual for work I think is strong. I don't have a fully articulated reason for this. I've thought about it, and what I come back to is the quality I described on the drive out. The sense that the site was not performing for me, that it was there for its own reasons and I'd happened to be present. There's something about putting those photographs in a gallery, about making them part of my public work, that feels like taking credit for an encounter I was only incidentally part of. The claim was there before I arrived. The lantern was lit for reasons that had nothing to do with me. The photographs document something that was already happening, and making them mine to exhibit feels wrong in a way I can't completely rationalize. So they stay in the studio. I look at them. Sometimes I think about the man who came out to the Eastern Sierra and worked that ground for 2 seasons, and then disappeared from the record. And I think about the lantern burning in the dark for reasons that have persisted longer than he has. And I leave the photographs where they are. I want to tell you about a conversation I had at the Bodie Visitor Center the spring after the October trip, when I went back for a different shoot and stopped to look at the exhibit material. There was a seasonal ranger there, a young woman, and we got talking the way you do when there are no other visitors and the day is slow. And I mentioned that I'd been out on the back road the previous October, the dirt road across the flat toward the highway, and that I'd seen something unusual. I didn't describe the claim site in detail. I just said I'd seen a structure with a light in it that wasn't there the next morning. She listened without the defensive body language that park staff sometimes get when a visitor starts on something strange, just listened. And then she said, "On which flat?" And I said, "East of the main road, before you get to the highway." And she said, "Yeah, people see things out there sometimes." I asked her what she meant by things. She said lights, structures, pieces of equipment. Things that were consistent with the mining era and that weren't there in daylight. She said it happened more in the fall, late season, October, and November, and that the Park Service had a policy of not discussing it with visitors because it created complications. But that among the seasonal staff, it was known that the flats around Bodie had that quality, the historical material surfacing under certain conditions. She said she'd been told by a ranger who'd worked the area for 15 years that the fall nights were when the light was right. Something about the angle of the late year sun and the cooling air above the volcanic rock, and that the light and temperature conditions in October created whatever the conditions were that allowed the 1890s era landscape to surface. She said it very matter-of-factly, as if landscape surfacing was a normal thing to describe. And then visitors came in and she excused herself, and we didn't speak again. I drove home with the confirmation sitting next to me on the passenger seat, the way important information sits. I've gone back to that flat twice since. Both times in daylight, both times at roughly the same location as the GPS coordinates from that night, and both times nothing was there. The scrub is ordinary scrub, the rock outcroppings are ordinary rock outcroppings. There is no evidence of historical mining activity visible at the surface in that specific spot. The historical mining records I found place a claim nearby but don't give coordinates precise enough to confirm exact location, so I can't rule out that I was 100 yards off and the actual claim site has underground remains I couldn't see from the surface. What I can confirm is that wherever the structure was that night, it wasn't there in daylight. 2 visits, same GPS point, nothing. The photographs are the thing I sit with. I've shown them to 3 people, 2 of them photographers, one of them a historian who works with Bodie area material. The photographer said the photographs were technically consistent with what I described. A working oil lantern at night produces that quality of light. The structure and equipment are consistent with 1890s mining clay material. The image has the properties you'd expect from the sensor and the conditions. There's nothing in the photographs that indicates fabrication or digital manipulation. The historian said the equipment visible in the photographs matched period material closely enough that if the photographs had been given to them without context, they'd have assumed they were taken at a documented site with preserved equipment. They asked me which site it was. I told them I didn't know. They asked if I could take them there. I said I didn't think I could. I don't know what that means. I know what I saw, and I know what I photographed, and I know what wasn't there in the morning. And the gap between those things is where I've been living with this for 3 years. Story 9. My name is Carmen, and I'm 63 years old, and I want to tell you something that happened to my son and me on a road trip that I've been thinking about for 11 years. My son is now in his 30s, and he remembers it too, and he has told me he would like this on the record somewhere. So I'm doing it for both of us. We were driving from our home in Stockton to visit my mother in Bakersfield, which is a drive we did several times a year, always the same way south on 99 through the valley, past the farms and the small towns, the drive that is very flat and very straight and very long. This was a summer afternoon, maybe 2 o'clock. The heat enormous the way it is in the valley in August. And my son was 17 and in the passenger seat being 17, which is to say he was half asleep and not interested in the landscape. I want to tell you about Highway 99 the way I know it, because I grew up with it, and it's different from the 5. The 99 is the old road, the one that went through the towns rather than around them. And it still does. It passes through Fresno and Tulare and Delano, through the downtown centers, and along the sides of the road, there's the full history of the valley, the old motels and the packing sheds and the farm worker communities and the fruit stands, the accumulated evidence of 100 years of agricultural economy. There are places on the 99 where you can see 3 or 4 generations of infrastructure. In one glance, the newest highway signage over an older bridge, over an older canal crossing that had a still older road crossing before it. It's a road with layers, and the people who have worked the valley for generations, my family included, are part of those layers. My mother's family has been in this part of the valley since before I was born, and her mother's family before that, and the road between Stockton and Bakersfield is a road my family has been driving and walking long enough that we are, in a small way, part of its accumulated history. I say this because what happened on that drive has always felt connected to that history in a way I can't entirely explain, which is a drive we did several times a year. Always the same way, south on 99 through the valley, past the farms and the small towns. The drive that is very flat and very straight and very long. This was a summer afternoon, maybe 2 o'clock. The heat enormous the way it is in the valley in August. And my son was 17 and in the passenger seat, being 17, which is to say he was half asleep and not interested in the landscape. We were somewhere past Fresno, south of the city, when I noticed the child. She was standing on the shoulder of the highway on my right, facing the road, watching the traffic. A girl, maybe 8 years old, alone, in a dress, in the middle of the afternoon in August in the Central Valley. No adult with her, no car pulled over, no one else anywhere near. I was going highway speed, and I passed her before I could decide what to do, and I said to my son, "Did you see that child?" And he sat up and said, "What? Where?" I said, "A little girl on the shoulder, alone." He turned around and looked back and said he didn't see anyone. I told myself she had a parent just out of view. Had a car I'd missed? There was an explanation. We kept driving. About 10 miles further, I saw her again. Same girl, same dress, standing on the shoulder, watching the traffic. Identical position, identical posture. I said to my son, "She's there again, look." He turned and this time he saw her too. And he said, "That's the same girl." And I said, "Yes." And I slowed down and looked in my mirror, and she was standing there, watching traffic, and when I looked, she was looking at my car, specifically. My mirror was good enough to see that she'd tracked my car. I kept driving because I didn't know what to do. I drove another few miles, and I pulled off at an exit, and I sat with my hazards on, and I said to my son, "That child is alone on a major highway." We went back. We drove back north on 99 to where I estimated she'd been, and there was no one. We drove slowly for 2 miles in each direction looking at the shoulder, and there was no child, no adult, nothing to explain her. My son was quiet in the way he got when something had actually gotten to him, which was unusual for 17. I got back on 99 and kept going south, and we didn't talk about it for a while. About 30 miles north of Bakersfield, she was there again. Third time. Same girl, same dress, on the shoulder, watching the traffic. And this time when I slowed, she did something she hadn't done the first 2 times. She raised one hand and pointed. Down the road south, in the direction we were going. She was pointing in the direction we were traveling, and she kept the point as we passed. And I watched her in my mirror as long as I could, and she was pointing the whole time we were visible to her, as if she was trying to make sure we understood the direction. We got to my mother's house without anything else happening, and I told my mother about it that evening, and my mother is a practical woman, a woman of faith, and she said without hesitation that the child was showing us the road was safe, that this was a thing she had heard of before, a person who watched over a section of road and showed travelers the way. I asked her where she'd heard this, and she said from her own mother, who'd been from a part of Mexico where such things were understood, where the roads had watchers who were not the living, and that what they did was what we'd seen they watched, and they pointed the way. And that the pointing was a communication of something like, "You're going the right way. Keep going." I want to tell you what my son said in the car after the third sighting, because he was 17 and not given to saying things without thinking about them first. And what he said was more than I expected, and he said, "She's been there the whole drive." Not all 3 sightings were her. He meant she'd been there, watching the road, the whole length of the valley. And we'd just seen her 3 times because we'd been the ones looking. He said it with the flat certainty that teenagers sometimes have about things that adults overcomplicate. and I thought about it and I couldn't argue with it. The pointing had been the same each time, the same dress, the same still attention to the traffic. Not 3 separate appearances, but 3 glimpses of something that was there the whole length of the road. Whether that means she watches the road between Stockton and Bakersfield all the time, or only sometimes, or only on certain days, or only for certain drivers, I don't know. But my son's instinct was that we'd been seen by something that sees everyone who drives that road, and that the 3 times we'd seen her were the 3 times she'd decided to make herself visible to us specifically. Before that conversation with my mother, I want to tell you about the conversation I had with my son when he came home from college the first Christmas after it happened. He'd had a year to think about it, and he was different from the boy in the passenger seat, more deliberate, more willing to say the thing directly. He said he'd been thinking about the girl and about what it meant that she pointed, and that he'd looked up some things about the old roads in the valley, the pre-highway routes, the ways people had traveled before the 99 existed. He said the corridor between Stockton and Bakersfield had been a travel route for a very long time, that before the highway there was a wagon road, and before that, a trail, and before that a path that the native people of the valley had used to move between their communities for generations, and that the 99 was the latest version of a corridor that was old enough to have accumulated centuries of travel in both directions. He said he thought the girl was part of that accumulation, part of the very long record of people using that route to go between places they needed to go, and that whatever had built up from that use over centuries was old enough and established enough to manifest in the way she'd manifested, watching the way the traffic had always moved through that corridor, pointing the way someone who knew the route and cared about the travelers would point. My mother was from Jalisco, and she came to the valley as a young woman, and the valley has been her whole adult life, and she understood the valley the way people understand, a place they came to on purpose and chose to stay in. She understood the fields and the seasons and the families and the labor, the whole of it, and she also understood the old things in it, the things her mother had told her about, the things that belonged to the country longer than any of the current farms or roads or towns. She didn't talk about those things often because they weren't something you talked about freely. But when she talked about them, she talked about them with the matter-of-fact respect that she talked about the weather. Real things that you accommodated without making them larger than they were. When she told me about the road watcher, the thing her mother had told her about, she said there was a word for it that she'd been told as a child. A word in Spanish that she said had an older word underneath it, a word from before Spanish, and that the older word was the one that meant it properly, but that she'd only ever heard it a few times, and wasn't certain she could say it correctly. She said the concept was of someone who had cared about the road, who had cared about the travelers on it so much and for so long that the caring had outlasted the person and kept going, that it had become a permanent feature of the road, the way a deep rut becomes a permanent feature of a dirt road, worn in by repetition until it was part of the road itself. She said you didn't have to have died on the road to be a watcher of it. You could have walked it every day for decades, or cared about the people who walked it, or simply given enough attention and love to that particular passage between places that the attention and the love accumulated into something that persisted. She said the old people understood this about certain roads. The 99 had been a travel corridor long enough to have many layers of that accumulated care. I talked to my mother about it more in the years that followed, when she was older and I was older, and we had the kind of conversations you have when things don't need to be resolved, but do need to be said. She told me what her mother had told her, which was that the old road's not just 99, but any road that had been traveled long and hard, accumulated the attention of people who had cared about travelers, who had watched over the road because someone they loved had traveled it, or because the road had been dangerous and someone had decided the travelers needed watching. She said her mother's understanding was that these watchers were not only the dead, but also something larger, something that the care and attention of generations of people had built up into, the way a thing grows from accumulated intention. She said the pointing was something she'd heard about, specifically, that road watchers sometimes pointed the way, to show travelers the road ahead was clear, not because the travelers needed direction, but because pointing was the gesture that meant safe passage, and that it had been known and recognized by people who traveled those roads for a long time. I have thought about this differently over the years, and I'm not sure what I believe it was. But the pointing, that child pointed in the direction we were already going, and I felt, when I saw it, not fear, but something I would call reassurance. And I've driven that section of 99 many times since, and I have never seen her again except I saw her once more, and I need to tell that too. A few years after my son left for college, I drove that route alone for the first time, making the Stockton to Bakersfield run to visit my mother, who was getting older and needed checking on more often. I didn't see the girl on that trip or on several trips after, and then 2 years ago, going south on a November afternoon, she was there. Third time in my life, first time without my son, on the shoulder of the 99, in the same dress, in the same still posture. I'd been thinking about my mother, who was unwell and whose condition was worrying me, and the girl was on the shoulder and she was pointing south, in the direction I was going, in the direction of my mother. I drove on. I got to my mother's house that evening, and she was having a good day, one of the better days in a difficult stretch, and we had dinner together, and she was sharp and funny and herself. I sat across that table, and I thought about the pointing, and I thought reassurance was still the right word, and I have never once felt unsafe on that road since. Story 10. I'm a retired firefighter from San Bernardino County, 30 years in, and I've been in situations that would end most people's appetite for being frightened. So take that for what it's worth when I tell you that what happened on the Angeles Crest Highway 2 summers ago is the only time in my adult life I've driven somewhere I couldn't explain and haven't been back. The Angeles Crest is a 2-lane that runs across the San Gabriel Mountains north of LA, up into country that most LA residents don't know exists, 40 minutes from their front doors. Real mountains, deep canyons, forest, elevation that goes above 7,000 feet. I drove it regularly the whole length of it because I like the mountains and because it's one of the genuinely beautiful drives close to where I live. I know the road. I'd gone up mid-morning on a Tuesday in July, which is the right time. Weekday traffic is light. The heat hasn't built yet, and the forest is doing what it does in early summer. That specific green, dark smell of mountain chaparral and pine that I've always found more restorative than anything else I know. I want to describe what the Angeles Crest is for people who don't know it, because most people who know LA don't know it exists, and this is relevant. The San Gabriel Mountains rise immediately north of the LA basin, steep and abrupt, and the range runs for about 50 miles east to west, with elevations up to 10,000 feet. The Angeles Crest Highway goes up into them from La Canada Flintridge and crosses the range entirely, coming out the other side near Wrightwood, and it passes through country that is genuinely remote, not remote in the recreational sense, not groomed wilderness with established trails and cell service, but working mountain wilderness with fire roads and canyons that haven't been visited by humans in years. The mountains are old. The San Gabriels are one of the fastest uplifting mountain ranges in North America. Geologically active, cut by deep canyons that are constantly being rearranged by landslide and flood, and they are, in the estimation of the geology, quite new as mountains go, but the land under them, the underlying structure, is ancient Precambrian basement rock in places, some of the oldest surface rock in California. There's a paradox in the San Gabriels that I'd been told about, but hadn't fully understood until that day. They look recent because they're steep and sharp-edged and erosionally active, but they sit on ground that is enormously old, and in certain conditions, in certain places, The old ground shows through the new mountains. This is geology. But it was also, I've come to think, a description of exactly what happened to me on the descent that July afternoon. Weekday traffic is light. The heat hasn't built yet, and the forest is doing what it does in early summer. That specific green, dark smell of mountain chaparral and pine that I've always found more restorative than anything else I know. I hiked a section I liked, ate lunch at a pullout with a view that goes for 50 miles on a clear day, and started home in the early afternoon. About 20 minutes into the descent, I turned onto a stretch of the highway I'd driven many times, and I didn't recognize it. Not the way you don't recognize something because you're tired. I wasn't tired. Not the way you don't recognize something at night, that you know in daylight it was afternoon, full light. I simply did not recognize the road. The curves were wrong. The canyon on my right was deeper than I expected and wider, and the ridge above it had a profile I didn't know. The forest on my left was denser and older looking than it should have been for that elevation. Big diameter timber that the San Gabriels don't have in that quantity in the places I'd been. I had the specific and fully alert sensation of being somewhere I had never been. On a road that was shaped like Angeles Crest, but was not Angeles Crest. I know what I sound like. I've told exactly one other person this story, and they said the same thing yours is saying right now. But I had driven this road perhaps 40 times, and I knew the grades and the curve signatures and the canyon profiles from memory. The way a person who drives a road 40 times knows it. And for approximately 4 miles of that descent, I was not on a road I'd ever been on before. I saw no other vehicles, and that was the thing I noticed within the first mile that added to the wrong place feeling. Angeles Crest on a Tuesday afternoon is not busy, but it's not empty. There are always other cars, hikers' trucks at the trailheads, the occasional motorcycle. I drove 4 miles and saw nothing. No other vehicle, no parked car, nothing at any trailhead. And the trailheads themselves weren't in the right places. And then I came around a curve, and the canyon was the right depth, and the ridge was the right profile, and I was back on the Angeles Crest Highway I knew. And there was a car behind me, and a truck coming the other way, and I was 40 minutes from home. I pulled over at the first pullout and sat for a bit. On my phone, the location showed me on Angeles Crest Highway, no interruption, just the road. Whatever I had been on for 4 miles, the phone hadn't noticed. I drove home and I sat with it, and I eventually talked to a man I'd worked with for years, a guy who'd grown up in the San Gabriels and knew those mountains the way my grandfather knew the Central Valley. He listened and he said there were places in the San Gabriels where the road went somewhere else for a little while. And he said it with the matter-of-fact directness of someone who had accepted a thing over time rather than one who believed it as folklore. He'd grown up in the mountains, he said, and his father had grown up there, and the knowledge of the places where the road didn't go where it was supposed to go had been passed down the way you pass down knowledge of which creeks flood and which roads wash out as practical information rather than supernatural claim. He said the places where it happened were consistent. Same stretches, reliably, not random sections that changed. He said he'd mapped them mentally over 40 years of driving those mountains, and he could predict with reasonable accuracy where you might go somewhere else for a while. He said the consistent quality of the locations suggested to him that the something else places were features of the underlying terrain rather than random discontinuities, that the old mountain, the Precambrian basement, and the Cretaceous structures beneath the current range had its own geography, and that in the places where the current geography was thin over the old geography, the old showed through. He said it like a mechanic explaining why a car behaves strangely in certain temperatures. The mountain has old parts and new parts, and the old parts don't always agree with the new parts, and the disagreements are the places where the road goes wrong. I asked him if he'd ever told a geologist this. He said yes, once, and the geologist had been interested in the tectonic and stratigraphic parts, and had dismissed the going somewhere else parts as visual artifacts of fatigue or dissociation, and that he hadn't bothered arguing because You can't argue someone into accepting an experience they haven't had. He said I'd had the experience now, and that was better than any argument. He said hikers had noticed it too, that a trail would go somewhere it wasn't supposed to go, and come back to the main trail further along, and the hiker would have been on terrain that didn't match the map. He said the mountains were old and had their own geography, and that sometimes the road overlay and the mountain geography weren't in agreement, and I've already told you the rest of what he said. But there was one more thing he said that I saved for last because it's the part I find most useful, the most practically applicable to anyone who drives mountain roads long enough to encounter the same phenomenon. He said the key thing was not to stop in the stretch where the road went somewhere else. He said his father had told him this, and he'd confirmed it himself, that people who stopped in the wrong geography stretches, who pulled over or slowed to a crawl or tried to orient themselves, had worse outcomes than people who kept moving at a steady pace. He said stopping invited engagement from whatever was in the wrong geography, and that the wrong geography was not hostile exactly, but was not calibrated for you, was running on conditions that didn't include your presence, and that the longer you spent in it, the more it had a chance to incorporate you into its pattern. He said driving through steadily was the equivalent of not answering when something calls from the other side of a fence you don't know the nature of. You keep moving, you stay in your own travel, and you come out the other end. He said he'd had people in the mountain communities go missing in the San Gabriels, hikers and drivers, in specific sections of the mountains that he knew as the wrong geography sections, and that the missing ones had in common, when the search and rescue accounts were pieced together, a tendency to have stopped in the wrong place, to have gotten out of their vehicle or stepped off the trail in a section where the terrain was doing something the map didn't show. He said the rule was so simple it was almost insulting. Keep moving, follow the road, come out the other side. I'd done it right without knowing the rule. I count that as luck. He said the mountains were old and had their own geography, and that sometimes the road overlay and the mountain geography weren't in agreement. But I want to add what I told him about the experience itself, the quality of the 4 miles, because I didn't include it before, and it's the part I think matters most. The something else road, the road I was on for those 4 miles, did not feel wrong in the way that dangerous or threatening things feel wrong. It felt old. That's the word I kept returning to as I drove it, old. Not in the way that old human things feel old. Not like an antique or a ruin, but the specific quality of oldness that's outside human scale entirely. The canyon on my right was too deep in a way that suggested geological time rather than recent erosion. The old growth timber on my left was the density of a forest that had never been logged, never been thinned, never been touched, the kind of growth that takes centuries to achieve. The road itself had the quality of something that had been there long enough to have grown into the landscape rather than been imposed on it. If I'm being precise, for 4 miles I was driving a road that felt like it had existed for much longer than any road in the San Gabriels has existed. As if I had crossed into a version of the terrain that was running on older time. And the complete absence of other vehicles felt like part of that. Like on this version of the road, there simply wasn't traffic, not because traffic was absent, but because traffic hadn't happened yet. And that the places where they disagreed were the places where you ended up somewhere else for a while. He said he'd learned not to stop in those stretches and to just drive through, and that if you drove through and came out the other side, you were fine. I had driven through. I came out the other side. I was fine. I want to be precise about what a hasn't been back means. I've driven Angeles Crest many times since that July. I want to tell you what the road was like when it came back. The moment I came around the curve and the canyon was the right depth again and there was traffic. Because that transition is part of the experience I haven't fully described. The return was abrupt, not gradual, not a slow normalization. One moment the road was elsewhere and the next it was Angeles Crest, completely all at once. The canyon geometry reset, the scale of the timber reset, the traffic appeared, and the quality of the air changed. From that particular stillness to the ordinary moving air of a mountain highway. The car behind me that appeared in my mirror was a white sedan, a specific make and model I recognized. Driving at a normal speed and maintaining a normal following distance, and its complete ordinariness after 4 miles of nothing was almost shocking. An ordinary car driven by an ordinary driver on a road I'd been driving for 4 miles and had not seen another car on. Suddenly, just there, as if the road had resumed its normal operation and incorporated this ordinary car into it from the moment of resumption. I pulled over at the first pullout because my hands were shaking slightly, which surprised me. I'd been calm in the wrong geography section. Genuinely calm. The old quality hadn't produced fear, but the return produced a kind of deferred adrenaline response that I hadn't expected. My body had been managing something without telling me about it, and the return was when the management fee came due. I sat for 10 minutes at the pullout, watching ordinary traffic go by, being grateful for the whiteness and mundaneness of that sedan, and then I drove home at a careful speed and didn't stop until I got there. I've driven Angeles Crest many times since that July. I drove it the following month in the evening when the light was different, and the following spring when the wildflowers were out on the south-facing slopes, and in November when the first dusting of snow was on the high points. All of those drives were normal. The road was the road, the canyons were the correct depth, and the ridgelines were the correct profile, and there was traffic, a car every few minutes, and everything was consistent with the road I'd driven 40 times before. Whatever had happened in July didn't happen again, or if it did, I didn't notice it, which may or may not be the same thing. What I haven't done is drive that specific section in July in afternoon conditions descending. I've thought about why I've avoided this specific combination of conditions, and I think it's not stubbornness or cowardice. I think it's something more like the respect for certain stretches of road that I've developed from enough time in the mountains. Some roads have their moments. The woman who watches the campground in western Pennsylvania has her season. The 395 woman is in November. The Grapevine has its specific grade. The Angeles Crest in July on the afternoon descent did something that afternoon and hasn't done it since. And whether that means the conditions that allowed it haven't recurred, or whether I've simply been lucky not to be in the wrong geography section when it's active, I don't know. What I do know is that the mountain man said, "Keep moving and come out the other side," and I did that, and I got home fine. And I have a superstition now about creating the conditions for a repeat by driving that specific stretch in those specific conditions. It might be nothing, but a 4-mile section of road that goes somewhere else is not something I need to recreate for curiosity's sake. But I haven't been back to that specific stretch in those conditions, and I'm still working out whether that's wisdom or stubbornness. Story 11. Short account because it's short and I won't dress it up. But I want to give you the context first, because the context is part of what I didn't have when it happened, and part of what changed how I've held it since. I make the LA to SF drive 4 or 5 times a year, always on 5 because it's faster. I do it usually at night because the daytime drive through the valley is hot and boring, and night driving clears my head in a way I find valuable. I know the 5 the way regular drivers know it, which is to say, I know the landmarks and the exits, and the sections where the road gets interesting, and the sections where it's just moving through California at 65 miles an hour. The junction of the 5 and the 46 is not a place I'd have identified as particularly notable before that night. It's a flat desert junction with a truck stop and some fast food and the road going east toward the coast. A place where a lot of people turn off and a lot of people don't. I knew who James Dean was, which is to say, I knew the cultural outline, the actor, the 1950s, the crash, the mythology that built up afterward. I knew he died in a car accident in California, and I did not know the specific road or the specific car until after that night, which is a fact I want to be clear about. I'm going to tell you what I saw and then tell you what I found out afterward. And I want you to understand that the order matters. I was driving from Los Angeles to San Francisco alone, Highway 5 through the valley. The long, boring stretch that everyone drives and nobody loves. Night drive, I was making good time. Somewhere around the junction with the 46, which is the road that goes west to the coast through Paso Robles, and which is the road James Dean died on in 1955. I didn't know that at the time. I found it out later. And I want to be clear that it didn't influence my perception of what I saw, which I'm about to describe. I was at the junction and I saw, in the spread of my headlights, a car on the shoulder. Not unusual. What was unusual was the car. It was a Porsche 550 Spider, which, if you don't know cars, is a very small, very low, very specific sports car from the mid-1950s. And there are not many of them left in the world, in any condition. This one was silver, and it was in what appeared to be excellent condition, which made its presence on the shoulder of the I-5 at 11 at night even more incongruous. I slowed as I went past it, because you slow for things that don't make sense, and I could see it was empty. I pulled over about 100 yards up the road. The instinct was mixed partly the good citizen impulse to check on a broken down vehicle, partly something harder to name, a sense that I needed to stop even though the car had been unoccupied and I had no rational reason to involve myself. I sat in my car for maybe 30 seconds doing the calculation, and then I got out and walked back. I want to describe the walk back carefully, because the state I was in during it is relevant to what happened next. I was fully alert, not tired, not in any altered state. The night was clear, good visibility. The truck stopped behind me, casting enough light to see by. I walked 100 yards at a normal pace, and I was paying attention to the shoulder the whole way, looking for the car I'd pulled over for. And as I walked, I was also aware of something that I'm going to describe accurately, even though it sounds dramatic. The air at the junction felt different, not in temperature, not in wind and quality, a density that the surrounding desert didn't have. I've been in places before that had what I'd describe as historical weight, old battlefields and that kind of thing, and this was the same quality, an accumulated significance I could feel before my conscious mind had any information to attach it to. The junction had that quality. It felt like a place where something had happened that the place hadn't finished processing. I sat and I thought about what I'd seen, and I thought about the fact that an unoccupied 1955 Porsche 5.5 Spider in excellent condition parked on the I-5 shoulder was either a situation that needed help or a situation that I should drive away from fast. I got out of my car and walked back to look. It was gone. I walked back to where it had been, and the shoulder was empty. I stood there in the dark on the shoulder of the I-5, and there was no car. I went back to my car, and I pulled back out onto the highway, and I drove past the 46 junction, and it was an empty junction in the dark, and I kept going. I'm going to tell you about the night I got to San Francisco, after I'd looked up the junction and the car and the history, and was sitting in my friend's apartment with my phone, and that specific open feeling of having learned something significant. I called my wife, who was at home in LA, and I told her what I'd seen and what I'd found out. And I told her in the order it happened: the car first, then the empty shoulder, then the research. And she was quiet all the way through, and when I finished, she said, "Are you okay?" I said, "Yes, I was fine. I just needed to tell someone." She said, "Do you think it was him?" And I said, I didn't know. I didn't know what him even meant in this context. I didn't know if what I'd seen was a residual image of a specific car, or a collective memory of an event, or something the road held, the way roads apparently hold things. She said, "I think you called it in." And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "You saw the car on the shoulder and you pulled over to check on it. The same way people pull over when they see a stopped car." She said you were the person who pulled over that night at that junction and responded to what you saw, and that maybe that was the whole of what was needed, someone to stop and see it and respond. I said I hadn't done anything except walk back to an empty shoulder. She said, "You stopped, you saw it, you went back to look." She said sometimes stopping and looking is the whole of what's needed. I sat in my car on the shoulder of the I-5 for about 5 minutes after I'd walked back from the empty shoulder. I wasn't frightened. I was, more accurately, in that specific state that significant things produce where you're holding something carefully. Because you know it's fragile, and if you move too fast, it'll slip. I thought about the car. I thought about its condition, not dusty or road dirty, the way a vintage car being driven would be. Not show quality clean the way a trailer transported car would be, but the specific surface quality of something that had been in the same place for a long time, like the motel room photographs of the road. Like a thing that had been there, in that place for a long time. I thought about the emptiness of the car, the specific emptiness of a car whose driver is not coming back. And then I got back on the highway and kept driving. I looked it up when I got to San Francisco. James Dean was killed at that junction in September 1955. The car was a Porsche 550 Spider, silver. He called it Little Bastard. I have thought about this many times and I don't have anything useful to add to the thinking. I saw a car on the shoulder that wasn't there when I walked back to it, on the road it died on. I've driven that junction many times since because my route doesn't change. And I want to tell you what it's like to drive through a place you've had an experience at after you know the history. The junction looks like what it is in daylight. A flat desert interchange with the agricultural valley on one side and the mountains on the other. The 46 going west toward the coast through rolling hills, a gas station, and fast food at the junction. There's nothing visually remarkable about it. In daylight, I drive through it the same as I drive through any junction, and it's ordinary, but I'm aware of it in a way I wasn't before. The way you're aware of a place after you've been told its significance, not frightened, not hesitant, just attentive. The junction got my attention, and it keeps it. At night, it's different. Not frightening at night either, not anymore. But the quality I described when I walked back to the empty shoulder is still there. The density, the weight, the accumulated significance of a place where something important happened, and where that importance has been maintained by 60 plus years of people thinking about it, visiting it, driving the road specifically because of what happened there. I don't know what it does to a place when millions of people know what happened at a specific location and hold that knowledge as something meaningful. I think it does something. I think the James Dean Junction has been shaped by 60 years of being thought about the way important things get thought about. And that the car I saw on the shoulder, if it was what I think it was, a residual image of an object associated with an event of enormous cultural significance, may have been made more persistent by that attention rather than less. The more people who know it happened, the more the place holds it. If you have a better accounting of that, I'd genuinely like to hear it. I've offered it to several people and gotten several theories that I saw a replica car being transported by coincidence, that the junction's specific visual conditions in my headlights produced an optical artifact, that I confabulated the details after the fact because I found out the history later. I've considered all of these carefully, and I can't make any of them fit the full experience, which includes not just the car, but the quality of the junction, the weight of it, the air that was heavier than the surrounding desert. Let me tell you what I've concluded about places that are known the way the junction is known, because I've thought about this more than almost anything else from that night. James Dean died at that junction in 1955, and within years of his death, it had become one of the most visited accident sites in California. People drove the 46 specifically to see where he died. A memorial was erected. Decades of tourists, of fans, of people who felt some connection to Dean or to the mythology he represented, came to that junction and brought their attention with them, their feeling, their significance making. That has been happening for over 60 years. The junction has been thought about with an intensity that very few specific geographic locations ever receive. And it has been thought about in terms of death and loss and the specific tragedy of a young person at the height of their talent, which is a particularly charged emotional register. I don't know what concentrated human attention and emotion does to a physical location over time. I don't know if geography can absorb significance the way wood absorbs smoke, slowly and permanently. But I do know that when I walked back to the empty shoulder, before I found out any of the history, I felt the weight of the place in a way that had nothing to do with seeing a car. The weight was already there. The car may have been a manifestation of it, nor a coincidence, or a piece of the place's accumulated history surfacing under the right conditions. Whatever it was consistent with the location that has been carrying an enormous amount of human attention for a very long time. And I don't think it's unreasonable to think that carrying that attention does something to a place. What I've come to in the years since is something the long-haul trucker would probably understand. Some places on the road hold what happened to them. Some accidents are heavy enough, historically significant enough, freighted enough with the weight of what came after the mythology, the icon making, the decades of people going to that junction because of what happened there, that they've made a permanent impression in the geography of the road. The junction of the 5 and the 46 is one of the most visited accident sites in California, and even now, decades later, people pull off at that junction specifically to feel the weight of what happened there. I didn't know that when I pulled off, but I felt it anyway before I had any information about what I was feeling. Story 12. I'll tell this the way it happened, which is that it started boring and got strange slowly enough that by the time it was fully strange, I was already deep into it. I'll tell this the way it happened, which is that it started boring and got strange slowly enough that by the time it was fully strange, I was already deep into it. I'd taken a week off work and decided to drive the whole length of Route 1 from the Oregon border to the LA area, something I'd been wanting to do for years. I should explain something about myself first, which is that I work in logistics for a shipping company, and my entire professional life is about tracking things in space and time, knowing where things are, where they've been, where they're going, reconciling discrepancies between expected and actual position. I'm extremely good at knowing where I am. I don't get lost. I have a spatial memory that my family considers unusual. The ability to retrace routes I've only driven once, and to notice when something doesn't match what I remember. I say this because the experience I'm about to describe is the opposite of getting lost. I knew exactly where I was, the map agreed with me, and yet the road was showing me things it had already shown me. From the Oregon border to the LA area, something I'd been wanting to do for years. I left Crescent City on a Monday morning with no fixed schedule. Just a plan to drive south and stop when something looked interesting. The northern stretch of Route 1 is not the famous part. It's the lumber coast, redwood fog, small working towns, fishing boats, the kind of California that the postcards don't use. By Wednesday, I was through the Humboldt County towns and into the Mendocino coast, which is where things got interesting in the ordinary way. First, it's one of the most beautiful drives in the state. The dramatic cliffs and the village feeling of the towns. And I was in a good place, eating well, sleeping at whatever small motel caught my eye, nobody expecting me anywhere. On Wednesday night, I stopped at a motel in a small town I'll describe as being just north of Fort Bragg. A place with a dozen rooms and a proprietor who was an older man, probably late 70s, who gave me a key, an actual physical key, not a card, and pointed me at my room and seemed unbothered by a solo traveler arriving after dark. The way coastal motel proprietors at this price point have generally seen everything and are bothered by very little. I ate dinner at the one restaurant in town that was open, and I was back in my room by 9 and I slept well, deeply. The kind of sleep you get on the third night of a trip when your body has finally accepted the schedule change. Thursday morning, I got up early, the fog just starting to lift off the headlands. and I ate breakfast at the same restaurant that served a good scrambled egg and coffee that tasted like it had been made seriously. Then I got back in my car and headed south in good spirits. What I want to describe is the Tuesday, which was my first day, so you have a baseline for what the road looked like at the start. I drove this section from Crescent City to the Lost Coast, which is one of the less traveled parts of the whole route, the section that dips inland because the mountains come too close to the sea for a coastal road. That morning, I stopped at a beach access near Crescent City and took a photograph of a rock formation at the cliff edge, a specific configuration of 3 large rocks, the leftmost one higher than the other 2, with a natural arch worn through the base of the rightmost. I remember it because I almost stopped to photograph it twice before I actually did, pulling over and thinking better of it twice before finally stopping the 3rd time. I have the photo. The timestamp says 10:47 a.m. The location data says about 8 miles south of Crescent City, which is where things got interesting in the ordinary way. First, it's one of the most beautiful drives in the state. The dramatic cliffs and the village feeling of the towns. And I was in a good place, eating well, sleeping at whatever small motel caught my eye. Nobody expecting me anywhere. On Wednesday night, I stopped at a motel in a small town I'll describe as being just north of Fort Bragg, a place with a dozen rooms and a proprietor who was an older man, probably late 70s, who gave me a key and pointed me at my room and didn't need a credit card imprint, just cash, which was fine with me. I ate dinner at the one restaurant in town that was open, and I was back in my room by 9 and I slept well. Thursday morning, I got up and drove south. I had coffee in Fort Bragg and kept going, and around 11 o'clock, I realized I'd passed a landmark I'd seen before. Not earlier that morning, earlier in the trip. A very specific configuration of rocks at the cliff edge, a formation that I'd taken a photograph of on Monday morning near Crescent City, hours north. I stopped and took out my phone and found the photo from Monday, and looked at the rocks outside my windshield, and they were the same formation. I told myself I'd misremembered. I drove on. At noon, I was in a town I had the strong impression I'd been through before. The same layout of the main street and the same harbor, and I started checking my photos again. I found one from Monday afternoon that matched the view out the restaurant window. I sat in the restaurant and looked at my own photos, and I had no explanation. Here's where my logistics brain kicked in, and here's where the logistics brain turned out to be the wrong tool for the job. I did what you do when you have a discrepancy between expected and actual inventory. I audited systematically. I went through all my photos in order, matched them to GPS location data, and tried to find the discontinuity, the place where the data stopped matching my position. And what I found was that there was no discontinuity. The photos were in location order. The GPS track was continuous and correct. The timestamp showed normal progression. According to all the data that I had driven south on Route 1 in a completely normal, non-repeating sequence. The data said I had not been to these places before. My photographs and my memories said I had. Both data sets were internally consistent, and they were mutually contradictory. And I sat in that restaurant in the Mendocino town that I had definitely been in before, and had definitely not been in before. And I stared at my phone for about 20 minutes before I put it away and ate my lunch and decided I was going to let the road do whatever the road was doing and keep driving south. Before I left the motel that Thursday morning, I knocked on the office door and the old proprietor opened it, and I told him I was checking out and thanked him. And I asked him because I was 3 days into something I didn't understand and wanted any information available, whether he'd noticed anything unusual about this stretch of the coast road. He looked at me with the specific look that says someone has been asked the right question. A look of slight surprise and something that was almost satisfaction, and he said, "The road shows people things sometimes." I asked what he meant. He said he'd run the motel for 22 years, and certain guests came back saying they'd driven sections they'd already driven and seen things they'd already seen, and that he'd learned to just tell them to keep going south and not fight it. He said the coast between here and Mendocino had its own logic, and if you tried to impose your logic on it, you'd confuse yourself. He said the guests who had the best trips were the ones who let the road decide what to show them. I asked him if it happened a lot. He said enough that he knew about it. He said it in the same tone the Needles motel woman had said occasionally. And I thought about how many people must have come through these coast motels over decades with the same confusion I had, saying the road showed them the same thing twice, and how many proprietors had learned the same instruction. A whole hospitality practice built around a road with its own curriculum. At noon, I was in a town I had the strong impression I'd been through before, the same layout of the main street and the same harbor, and I started checking my photos again. I found one from Monday afternoon that matched the view out the restaurant window. I sat in the restaurant and looked at my own photos, and I had no explanation. I kept driving, and by mid-afternoon, the familiar place sensation was happening every half hour or so. Stretches of coast I knew I'd driven already, intersections I'd stopped at, the feeling of repeating a sequence I'd already run. I was not lost. Route 1 only goes one direction. I could not have doubled back without knowing it. I checked my phone map and it showed me progressing normally south, and yet the road was showing me things I'd seen before, over and over, as if it was showing me its repertoire of dramatic coastal scenery, and certain pieces kept recurring. I called a friend that afternoon, the only person I talked to that week, and she said it sounded like a highway hypnosis thing. The monotony of driving producing memory confusion, which is a reasonable explanation for one or two familiar-looking stretches. Not for 20. I have photographs, time-stamped and location-tagged, of the same physical features taken 3 days and 100 miles apart. And the features are the same features. I got to the end of the trip. I made it to LA on schedule. Nothing bad happened. I drove the whole coast, and I'm glad I did, and I'd do it again. I want to tell you about Friday, which was my last full day on the road, because I think it was the coast's way of making a point. By Friday, I'd stopped fighting the repetitions and stopped auditing the data. I'd accepted that the coast was showing me what it wanted to show me, and that my job was to drive and pay attention, and not demand a consistency that wasn't being offered. And on Friday, the repetitions stopped. Friday was entirely new, a section of coast I'd never photographed anything matching, towns with no counterpart in my Tuesday or Wednesday memories, sea conditions and light that were specific to Friday and hadn't appeared before. It was as if the coast had been doing something during the middle days of the trip, running me through its catalog, showing me its range, demonstrating the quality of its scenes, and then on the last day, let me see fresh country, new things, the reward for not resisting the demonstration. I've told this to two people since. One said I was experiencing highway hypnosis and memory confabulation, which is a real thing, but doesn't account for the photographs. The other said Route 1 was a teaching road. I asked what that meant. She said some roads wanted you to look at them, really look, not just pass through, and that if you weren't looking, they'd find ways to make you look. And that the way Route 1 taught looking was by showing you the same things multiple times until you saw them, really saw them, rather than glancing and moving on. She said the Thursday when I stopped fighting and just drove was the day I started looking, and Friday was the reward. I don't know if she's right, but the Thursday transition is accurate. Friday was more beautiful than any day before it. I got to the end of the trip. I made it to LA on schedule. Nothing bad happened. I drove the whole coast, and I'm glad I did, and I'd do it again. But I think about the road giving me the same things multiple times, and the rocks and the headlands and the harbor towns. And I've come to the thought that the route was testing something or demonstrating something, or possibly just operating according to its own logic that doesn't match the logic of a person with a time-stamped camera. I want to tell you about the specific stretch that repeated most. Between Fort Bragg and Point Arena, there's a section of coast where the cliffs are highest and the road is closest to the edge, and the view on a clear day extends far enough south that you can see the curvature of the coastline going on toward the Bay Area. This section appeared in my experience 4 times over 3 days. Not 4 similar sections, the same section, with the same specific features, the same rock formation at a particular headland, the same gravel turnout at the same point on the road. 4 times I drove that 1.5 miles of cliff road. And each time I drove it, I saw something different in it. The first time it was scenic. The second time it was familiar. The third time, it was overwhelming in a way I wasn't prepared for. The size and age of it landing on me differently in the third repetition than it had in the first 2. The fourth time, it was just the coast, just the cliff and the water and the light. And I drove through it slowly, and I understood that the 4 passes had been teaching me how to see it. That the first 3 were approaches and the fourth was arrival. That's what I mean by the teaching road interpretation. Not that the road intended something, not that consciousness was involved in any human sense, but that the repetition had a structure, and the structure had a sequence, and the sequence ended in something that felt like comprehension rather than confusion. I don't have a physical mechanism for that. I have the experience of it, and the experience was that the coast between Fort Bragg and Point Arena taught me how to look at it over 4 passes, and after the 4th pass, I understood what I'd been looking at in a way I hadn't before. 3 of those passes produced evidence I can point to in time-stamped photographs. One of them produced a different kind of evidence. The kind that doesn't show up in photographs, but stays with you longer. Route 1 is old, the coast is older. And what I think I was given during those 3 middle days of repetition was a chance to actually look at the coast rather than photograph it, mark it, check it off a list. My professional relationship with landscape, the logistics instinct, was to process it, categorize, track, record. The coast interrupted that processing and made me be present in a way that processing prevents. You can't process the same headland for the 4th time in 2 days. At some point, you stop trying to categorize it and you just look at it. And the looking is different from the processing. It's slower and less efficient, and it takes the whole thing in rather than extracting data from it. I think about the teaching road interpretation my friend offered, and whether a road can do something intentional, whether intention is even the right category for what a road can do. I don't know the answer to that. What I know is that the coast between Crescent City and LA is very old, and has been looked at for a very long time by many generations of people, and that it has been used as a travel corridor and a resource and a home for longer than any road has been there, and that whatever accumulated attention and use and significance does to a place, the California coast has accumulated a great deal of it. Whether that produces something you could call intention or preference or curriculum, I don't know. But the trip felt like being taught something. And what it taught me was to look, and Friday was very beautiful. Route 1 is old, the coast is older. Whatever the coast decides to show you on any given day of driving it, I'm not sure you're the one making that decision. Last story coming up, and it's one of the strongest ones in the inbox. Before we get there, if you've been listening the whole way through tonight, thank you. And the single most useful thing you can do is subscribe and share one episode with one person you think would appreciate it. That's the whole of what keeps a channel this size going. And if you've driven California's roads and you've got something to report, the address is in the description. Here's the last account. Story 13. I want to start by saying that I've told this story once to my sister, who is the person I tell everything to. And her response was to be quiet for a moment and then say, I've always wondered about that stretch of road. Which is the kind of response that takes a story from being your private, strange experience to being a thing the world seems to have opinions about already. And that response is part of why I'm submitting this. I want to tell you what I know about the Emigrant Canyon before I tell you what I saw in it. Because the history is the context. The Panamint Range is the western wall of Death Valley, and the passes through it are real mountain passes, high and steep, and technically demanding even in a modern vehicle. In the 19th century, they were death traps. The Death Valley 49ers, the immigrant party that gave the valley its name, went through the region in 1849 to 1850. In circumstances of terrible suffering, animals dying, wagons abandoned, people dying of thirst and exposure in the desert. Not all of them went through Emigrant Canyon. The routes varied. But that canyon and that pass saw hard traffic in those years and in the decades after, as prospectors and settlers attempted the crossing, some successfully and many not. The name Emigrant itself is a record of this history. The canyon named for the people who used it. The bones of wagons have been found in the Panamints. People have been finding artifacts of 19th century crossings in those ranges for 150 years. When I tell you I saw a wagon and a man in the canyon, I'm telling you I saw something in a place that has very specific history and where 19th century material culture has been turning up for over a century. Who is the person I tell everything to? And her response was to be quiet for a moment and then say, I've always wondered about that stretch of road. Which is the kind of response that takes a story from being your private, strange experience to being a thing the world seems to have opinions about already. And that response is part of why I'm submitting this. I grew up in Southern California and did a solo road trip to Death Valley. A few years ago, in March, the wildflower year when everyone was going. I know Death Valley well. I've been there a dozen times and I wasn't doing anything unusual. I went in on the 127 from Baker, drove around the valley for a couple of days, and was heading back out through the Panamint Range on the Emigrant Canyon Road to connect with the 190 and eventually the 395. It's a beautiful drive out of the valley, a real mountain road, switchbacks. The canyon walls close on both sides, and it comes out high on the range with views that stop you cold. I was driving out alone, early morning, 6-something, before the day visitors had started coming in. I want to describe what Emigrant Canyon looks like in early morning March light, because I've been there many times, and the quality of the light at that hour in that canyon is one of my favorite things in California. And the canyon walls are volcanic and sedimentary, banded in ochre and rust and cream and gray, and the early light on them is warm, in a way that's not sentimental but physical. The sun angle in early spring hitting the east-facing walls at exactly the angle that makes the colors most saturated. By mid-morning, the light is harsher and the canyon goes flatter and less dramatic. The 6 a.m. version of Emigrant Canyon is the one I drive for. The road switchbacks through the canyon on a one-lane paved surface that's in decent condition, and the turns are real turns, the kind that require you to slow down and pay attention, and not assume the road ahead is clear. There are pullouts at irregular intervals for passing, not always in convenient places. The canyon walls come very close to the road in the narrow section, which is a stretch of about a half mile where the volcanic formations pinch in and the road is in a slot that's maybe 20 feet wide at the widest. The Narrows have a specific feeling that's different from the rest of the canyon enclosed. Dim even in morning light, the air cooler and still, the sound of the engine louder off the walls. I've always driven the Narrows slowly, not just for safety, but because the Narrows reward slowness. The formations in the walls are extraordinary up close. The wagon was just before the Narrows. That placement has mattered to me in the years since, the specific placement. The Narrows were a natural choke point for any wagon crossing you had to go through them. There was no alternative route, and a heavy loaded wagon in a slot that narrow would have been a technical challenge, requiring the animals to be guided carefully and the wagon to be managed on the rock walls. Anyone who'd gotten to that point in the canyon had committed to the passage. You couldn't easily turn around in the Narrows. The road was empty. I was going slowly because the switchbacks deserve respect and because I wasn't in a hurry, and because early light in the Panamints is one of my favorite things, I was happy, is what I'm saying. I was relaxed and happy on a road I knew in a place I loved. I want that established before I tell you what happened. Partway up the canyon, just before the road tightens through a narrow section where the walls come in close, I came around a bend, and there was a wagon. Not a car, a wagon. A covered wagon, canvas-topped, 2 horses stopped in the road, and a man standing beside it who turned and looked at me when I came around the bend. I stopped my car. The man was wearing clothes from the 19th century, a long coat, a hat of the period, boots that were right for the era. He was looking at me without particular surprise. The horses were real horses. They moved their heads when I stopped, and I could see the breath coming off them in the cold morning air. I sat in my stop car and looked at this wagon and this man for probably 20 seconds. And I was not frightened, which is the thing I keep coming back to when I replay it. I was not frightened at all. I was confused and very still, the way you're still when something requires your full attention. And the man looked at me, and then he looked up at the canyon walls, and then he looked back at me, and he said something. I had my windows up against the cold, but I could see his mouth moving. I couldn't hear the words. He said something to me in the cold morning air in the Emigrant Canyon, and I could not hear it through the glass. I rolled down my window, and the wagon was not there. The man was not there. The road ahead of me was empty. The morning air came in cold and clean and smelled like rock and desert and nothing else. And the road through the canyon was empty as far as I could see. I drove through the canyon slowly. I got up to the ridge and pulled over at the viewpoint and sat for a while and looked back at the canyon I'd come up. I thought about the man, the wagon, and the direction they'd been facing, which had been up canyon, toward the pass, the same direction I was going. I thought about what it would have meant to bring a wagon over that pass in the 19th century. The sheer physical difficulty of it, the horses, the terrain, the distance still ahead. I thought about all the parties that had come through this pass on their way to somewhere they were trying to reach, and how many of them had made it, and how many hadn't, and what it might mean that I'd seen one of them stopped at the same narrows in the cold morning light. In the years since, I've done research that I wish I'd done before the trip, and I want to share what I found because it changes the weight of the account. The emigrant crossings through the Panamints were documented in journals and letters and later life memoirs, and a number of them describe encounters at or near the Narrows in Emigrant Canyon that have a quality I recognize. Not supernatural encounters. The journals I found were practical documents written by practical people, but descriptions of difficulty at that spot, of animals refusing to enter the Narrows, of wagons requiring extraordinary effort to manage through. One journal from 1850 describes the party stopping at the entrance to the Narrows for a full day because the lead animals wouldn't go forward, and the writer says they eventually entered at first light the next morning and that the passage went smoothly in the early light in a way it hadn't attempted at any other hour. First light. I was at 6 in the morning. Another journal from a later crossing in the 1860s describes a man who stopped at the Narrows entrance to look back at the canyon they'd come up. He specifically says he looked back. Down the canyon, as if assessing the distance traveled, and then turned and entered the Narrows and completed the crossing. That gesture of stopping to look back down the canyon before entering the Narrows is what I saw. The man I saw was doing what that diarist described, stopping at the Narrows entrance to look back at the way they'd come, assessing, and then, in my experience, though he was gone by then, presumably entering and crossing. He'd said something to me. That's the part I've spent the most time on. He looked at me, whatever I was to him, in my car, with my 21st century windows and phone mount and reusable coffee cup, and he said something. And I don't know if it was a warning or a direction or just something you say to a stranger on a mountain road. I didn't hear it. I had my window up against the cold, and I was too slow to roll it down before he was gone. And I've thought about that slowness, that 10-second delay between seeing him speak and reaching for the window. And I've thought about what I might have heard if I'd been quicker, if the window had already been down. My sister, when I told her, said she'd driven that road once and she'd always had the feeling coming up the canyon that she was following something, that she was on a route that had been used hard before roads existed, and that the canyon had that quality some places have of being a place where many different times overlap. I don't know the history well enough to know which parties came through Emigrant Canyon. I know the Mojave Crossing was brutal, and many people died attempting it. And I know the Panamints were in the way of anyone trying to reach the valley from the east. I know a man in 19th century clothing with a covered wagon was stopped in the Narrows in the early morning. And I know he looked at me and spoke, and I know I couldn't hear him, and I know he was gone when I rolled my window down. I want to tell you about my sister's full response when I told her, because I gave you only the first part before. After she said she'd always wondered about that stretch of road, she asked me to describe the man in detail, and I did the coat, the hat, the boots, the way he turned when I came around the bend. She said she'd read about the emigrant crossings in the Panamint journals because she'd become interested in Death Valley history. And she said that what I described was consistent with a man at a rest stop before a difficult passage. She said the emigrants who made it through the Panamint passes wrote about stopping before the hardest sections to check their equipment and their animals and their nerve, and that the Narrows in Emigrant Canyon were exactly the kind of section where you'd stop and look back at what you'd already accomplished before committing to what was ahead. She said the speaking was the part that interested her most. She asked whether in the journal accounts she'd read, there were records of the emigrants' state of mind at the Narrows. I said I didn't know. She said she'd look, and she did, and she sent me a passage a few weeks later from an 1850 journal that described the party stopped at the Narrows entrance. And the diarist wrote that the party leader had addressed them before entering, had said something to each person about the passage ahead, a word of encouragement or instruction, had spoken to everyone before they went in. She said she thought that might be what I'd seen the party leader doing what he'd always done, stopping at the Narrows, speaking to whoever was there, saying the thing you say before the hard part. She said, I think he was telling you the road was passable. My sister sent me the journal passage a few weeks after our conversation, typed out, with a note saying she'd found it in a digitized collection of Mojave Crossing accounts. The journal was from 1850, kept by a member of an emigrant party, and the relevant passage described the moment before the party entered the Emigrant Canyon Narrows. I'm going to give you the substance of it rather than exact quotation because it's not mine to reproduce, but the substance was this. The party leader stopped the wagon at the entrance to the Narrows and walked back to where the diarist was waiting. And he said to the diarist, and I'm paraphrasing, that the passage ahead was narrow but the footing was sound, and that the wagon would go through if the animals were kept steady and the pace was kept slow, and that the other side was not far, and the view from the ridge was worth the passage. He said this to each person in the party. The diarist noted, going down the line, a word to each one before they entered. The diarist wrote that the leader had the manner of someone who had done this before, who was telling you the truth about what you were about to face, rather than making it sound easier than it was, and that this was reassuring in a specific way, more reassuring than false ease would have been. I read that passage and I sat with it for a long time. The road was passable. The footing was sound. The other side was not far. That is what I think the man in the Narrows was saying, in whatever form and to whatever version of a traveler I appeared to him in the early morning. He'd said it to every member of his party before the hard part. He said it to me. I went back to Death Valley the following March, not for the wildflowers. There was no flower year that second time, but because I'd been thinking about the wagon and the man, and what I'd been too slow to hear, and I wanted to drive the canyon again. I went alone, same early morning timing, windows down this time, cold enough that I was grateful for the heater, but I wanted the windows down because I decided that if something was going to be said to me in the Emigrant Canyon, I was going to be in a position to hear it. The drive up was beautiful and ordinary. Dawn light on the canyon walls and the road doing what it does, no other vehicles. I came around the bend where the wagon had been, and there was nothing there. Just the road and the canyon walls and the cold, still air. I drove through the narrows, windows down, listening, nothing. I came out on the high Panamint Plateau, with the view down into Death Valley on one side and the Mojave on the other. The kind of view that makes you feel very small in the best possible way. And I pulled over and sat for a while with the windows down and the cold air coming in. And I thought about the man who'd stopped here 170 some years ago on his way over, with his wagon and his horses preparing for the Narrows. I thought about what he might have said. I thought about the things you say to a stranger on a difficult road, the things that are both direction and encouragement, the things that are specifically useful rather than generically reassuring. I thought about the road being passable, which my sister offered. I thought about the route ahead, which any party leader would know and any traveler coming from behind might need. I thought about the specific hard section of the Narrows and what it was useful to know about it. And I thought about how a man who had brought a wagon over that pass would know exactly what to say to someone who was about to attempt the same thing. I wish I'd had the window down. The wildflowers that year were extraordinary. Every mile of that drive was extraordinary. I'd go back tomorrow if I could, and I'd leave my windows down. I want to tell you what I've understood about that morning and the time since, the thing that took the longest to land, but that I think is the truest account of what happened. I was driving out of Death Valley in early March, alone in a car on a paved road at 6 in the morning, going east out of a place that has been one of the hardest crossings in California for as long as people have attempted it. And at the Narrows, at the specific hard part, a man who knew the road stopped and looked back and spoke to me, said what he said to everyone at that point in the passage. I didn't hear it, but I felt it in the way you feel a statement that's directed at you, even when you don't catch the words. The quality of being addressed, the turn of attention towards you specifically. He was telling me what he'd told everyone at the Narrows for as long as he'd been at the Narrows. The road is passable. The footing is sound. The other side is not far. Keep your pace, keep your animals steady, and the passage will go smoothly. He said it to an emigrant party in 1850, and he said it to me in whatever year I drove through, and he said it to everyone in between, and whether I heard him or not, the message arrived because I drove through the Narrows and came out on the high ridge, and the view was everything it was supposed to be. The whole Mojave spread out to the east, Death Valley behind me, the morning light on everything. The road was passable. It always was. I'd go back tomorrow and I'd leave my windows down, and I'd drive the Narrows slowly, and when I came around that bend before the tight section, I'd listen for what he says. 13 accounts from California's roads. What I keep noticing, reading through these, is that the road keeps being the thing, not a backdrop. Not just where the story happens, but something almost like a character in itself. Something that has its own memory, its own way of operating, its own reasons for showing people things. The 395 in November, the Grapevine in winter, the Emigrant Canyon in early March light, the Coast Road doing something with distance that the map doesn't account for, the 62 in the desert at night carrying something at a calibrated interval behind the only car on the road. People drive these roads and the roads give them something back, and most of the time what they give back is just miles. And then sometimes it isn't, and the something they give back is specific. It fits the person, it fits the moment, it fits the history of that particular stretch of asphalt and the ground underneath it. What I find most interesting, reading all 13 of these together, is how many of the road's communications are useful. The woman on 395 who needed to get home, the pointing on 99 that said safe passage, the call from the grapevine that needed to be made, the wagon driver who said the narrows were passable. The things on California's roads at night are not, in the aggregate, hostile. They seem, in the aggregate, to be doing what the roads have always done, which is move people and things between places and to have opinions about whether the passage is going well. The road at midnight in November has always had other traffic in it than the cars, and most of that traffic seems to have been going the same direction we're going. Take care on the roads, and leave your windows down when the road asks you something. This has been Park Ranger Files. What I keep noticing, reading through these, is that the road keeps being the thing, not a backdrop, not just where the story happens, but something almost like a character in itself. Something that has its own memory, its own way of operating, its own reasons for showing people things. The 395 in November, the grapevine in winter, the Emigrant Canyon in early March light, the coast road doing something with distance that the map doesn't account for. People drive these roads and the roads give them something back. And most of the time what they give back is just miles. And then sometimes it isn't. Take care on the roads. This has been Park Ranger Files.